sweet dreams are made of this.
My previous office was in Orchard Road. The building was supposed to be new and we just moved in. I have colleagues who are on shift 365 days a year, and one of them had the third eye and could see things. She told me she could see shadows running around the far end of our office very regularly, starting from 10 p.m. onwards. For me, I don't usually believe in such things, but after so many things happening in my life, and to people around me, I started believing that such things might actually be real. Who knows? Anyway, there was this day when I was supposed to go for a business trip. While packing my luggage and work stuff, I realized that I left something important in the office and had to go back to get it. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I reached my office with one of my friends. My friend waited for me at the reception counter while I switched on the lights and went to get the stuff from my desk. While walking to my desk, everything was super silent. So silent that I could hear a pin drop. The aircon was off, and everything was off. No sound at all. I got my stuff and proceeded to walk out of the office towards the reception area. As I was walking towards the reception area, I suddenly heard a constant ting, ting, ting sound at the far end of the corner. I didn't hear that when I walked in earlier, so I didn't bother about it and continued walking. When I reached the end of the office near the reception area to switch off the lights, suddenly there were heavy footsteps in the office. My balls immediately shrank and I got the hell out of there ASAP. This is a story about old furniture and why I don't like to buy second-hand items. It happened a few years ago when I was working for an SME. We had just moved to a new office the week before, on the second floor of a storehouse. Most of us had backlog to clear due to the shifting. That night, I decided to stay back and clear as much as I could. With the project already months behind due to my predecessors, I was eager as their replacement to prove my worth. As the rest of my colleagues left for home, one by one, my team lead walked over and asked me if I was going home. I replied that I was trying to clear some of the work and will be staying late. He gave me a strange look and started to say something before he caught himself, and gave me his classic, "I'm smiling because I can't say anything" smile, before saying goodbye and left. I was puzzled by that look, but soon forgot about it as I continued on with my work. The room grew colder without the rest of the company there, and I pulled my windbreaker tighter around me. Hunger was getting to me, as I hadn't had dinner yet, but that only served to motivate me to clear up faster and go for my meal. Then, I felt it. The feeling of someone staring at me, behind my back, someone angry, almost furious. I can't accurately describe in words how that stare felt like, only that it was icy and piercing, and the feeling immediately made my hair stand. At the same time, I noticed the familiar feeling of the air around me turning still, cold and damp, like a wet, transparent blanket thrown onto me. My body frozen up, and fear grabbed my mind like an iron claw. Slowly, I was able to think again, and forced my fingers to type a bit of gibberish to calm myself down. I remember that my back was facing the meeting room door, and it was left open when my colleagues went to turn off the lights. Trembling, I whispered, "Brother, I'm just trying to finish my work. Relax, okay?" The staring continued, and I was panicking in my seat. At that point, I suddenly remembered my talisman and reached for it to check that it's there, only to realize that I left it at home that day. The air around me felt heavier suddenly, and there was an unnerving feeling that whatever was staring at me was slowly creeping forward. In desperation, I started chanting every mantra I could remember off the top of my head. The weight around my body suddenly lifted, and I could feel whatever was staring at me back off into the shadows. I quickly packed up and ran off. The next day I came late on purpose and stole a glance at the meeting room before I sat down. After a while, my team lead leaned over and asked me if everything was okay last night. I spilled everything that happened last night as he listened intensely. After I finished, my team lead paused for a long time before telling me that the other team also had an encounter in the office. He was also the last person in the office, and he was walking to the pantry when he saw a woman walking towards him. Thinking that someone had walked into the office when he didn't notice, he was going to call out to her when she suddenly vanished. I shuddered and decided to hurry my work so that I didn't have to be the last to leave that night. Later that day, my boss called a meeting, and we had to go into the meeting room. Nervously, I sat through the meeting, looking around the room the whole time. After the meeting ended, I left in a hurry, and when I got back to my desk, I realized that I left my notebook inside. As I walked in to take my notebook, I felt a tinge of the sickening feeling in the air I felt last night, and noticed that it was coming from the 2 old chairs left behind by the previous tenant. They were old, handmade chairs that were painted over with cheap paint, one in green and the other red. Grabbing my notebook, I rushed out of the room. For a week or so after that day, I made sure to leave early and to always wear my talisman to work. One day, I came to work and noticed that something felt different. I checked the meeting room and noticed the chairs were gone. Eventually, I heard from the boss that the previous tenant had come back to take them. I didn't believe him. Whatever the truth is, none of us had any encounters after that. I have refused to buy any second-hand furniture since. This happened in the early 80s, when I was working in an office in Tryinng, somewhere opposite Moses Lim's bridal shop. I will not mention the unit number because this unit is still there under conservation. Every time I go to a restaurant in Tryinng for dinner, I will not fail to take a walk and see who the new tenant is. It seems to change very often. Well, here it goes. In the late 70s and early 80s, this unit was used as an office and leased out to 2 tenants, a travel agency and a construction company. The travel agency was using the front half of the unit, while the latter used the back half. I was then an employee in the construction company. When I first joined the company, I was always amazed to see the girls going to the toilet in twos and never alone. When I asked, the girls at the travel counter told me that the unit was haunted. A girl by the name of Jenny, who was also the boss's daughter, experienced it. It was around 9 p.m, and she was in the back portion of the unit, after my office where the toilet was. She was washing up her cup, preparing to go home with her sister-in-law, Chris. She suddenly saw an image of her sister-in-law, darting past through the mirror. Thinking that Chris was looking for her, she asked what it was for when she came out. Chris denied going to the back, and told her that she was not the only one with that experience. After that, they offered some joss sticks and left. The second incident happened to myself. It was lunchtime and I was the only one left in my office. The rest had taken the opportunity to go to the temple. The phone rang, and as I answered and spoke on the phone, I heard the parallel extension being lifted and hung up. After the call, I went out to see if my colleagues were back, but there was no one there, and the remaining girl at the travel counter told me none of them had returned yet. I simply shrugged it off, as I did not want to scare myself with it any further. Sometime later on a Sunday, another one of the girls from the travel counter, she was new and I shall call her Alice, experienced or rather saw something. It was around 4 p.m. and they were having an early dinner break before the rush hour. As she was eating, she saw from the corner of her eye that there was someone standing at the entrance to my office area, and upon closer inspection, realized that there was only a pair of legs with no upper body. Not surprisingly, she just stared and gestured towards the place with shock. Jenny, who was eating with her, guessed that something was not right, although she could not see what, and rushed to open the main tinted glass door to let in the sun. The apparition apparently disappeared at that point. Alice then described what she saw, and again they offered joss sticks to pray. Not too long after that, the travel company moved, and we were the only ones left there. On Christmas Eve of the same year, I received a call from the family living above my unit. He told me that he could smell something burning from downstairs in my office. I told him to go downstairs, lift up the roller shutter and take a look. He did and told me that it was on fire. Immediately, I called my boss and we rushed down to the office. Upon reaching it, we saw that there was no fire, or any sign of a fire. So we asked the mother of the guy that called me what it was all about. At that time, the guy came down, and his face was as white as a sheet. He told us that he saw some fire sparks flying about when he lifted the shutters. Soon after, we too moved. Not because of the hauntings, but because the authorities wanted to take over for conservation. During the 2 to 3 years that I was working there, I was asked a number of times by the people from the neighboring shops which unit I was working on. When told the address, they would all go, "It's so scary. Aren't you afraid?" The guy who called on Christmas Eve, who happened to live in the unit just above my office for all of his life, told me about the history of that place. Apparently, a girl committed suicide by hanging herself when she was jilted and haunted the place. She was wearing a blue, flowery samfu when she died. This explained why the girls always saw a fleeting image of blue with flowers and the pair of legs too. After that, her family moved and the place was converted into a gambling den of sorts. A man was killed when a fight broke out. Gamblers sometimes saw a puddle of blood where the man was killed, and after that, it was taken over by our landlord who converted it into an office. This story is true. As I write, the memories come back, and I feel shivers running down my spine. If any of my ex-colleagues happen to chance upon this story, please let me know. After I left my job as an assistant professor from Nanyang Technological University, I decided to set up a small company in the CBD area. I chose an office with a magnificent view on the 37th floor at International Plaza, Tanjong Pagar. It was considered as a small-sized office with merely 1,500 square feet. However, it fit my business strategy as a startup of a freelance IT consultant firm with a manpower of about 6. The rental was quite affordable too, well below the market rate. I particularly liked the furnishing as it was so posh. Cherry and walnut wood made of European-style fittings. It has a unique class of elegance in contrast with metal and glass modern design. The view is magnificent too. You can see most of the landmark buildings in Singapore, such as UOB Towers, SIA Building, DBS, Maybank and Capital Tower from the height of 37 stories. You may wonder why I tried to describe the office environment in such detail. That is because I hope we could get some clues on my horrible encounter as follows. Unfortunately, till today, there is no solid explanation relating to this mystery. At the back of this neat and posh office that gave certain people solemn feels, there laid a well-decorated bedroom and a little bunker room. The bunker room has only 4 walls and 1 ceiling, fitted with fluorescent lights. We called it a storeroom. Nothing strange. But what made me curious was the bedroom and its thick red carpets. The room has a spacious queen-size bed, built-in closet, and a large shelf in black lacquer finish. The shelf that was facing the bed had halogen lights that can light up each individual compartment, and a swirl base for the TV. The bedroom looked like a deluxe suite in a 5-star hotel. If the purpose is to serve as a napping bed for the boss, he surely had a very luxurious resting place. The horrible instance happened one afternoon at around 2 p.m. On this particular afternoon, I was alone in my office. All the other staff had been outstationed to work at my client's place. I felt rather tired and decided to take a nap in the storeroom on a sofa bed. The weather at about the same time suddenly worsened. Thick clouds were emerging from nowhere and covering most of the sky quickly. Rain poured down heavily on the windows and the sky was dark like dusk. Under some dim light from the corridor outside the storeroom, I lied down and tried to get some sleep. A few seconds later, even before I closed my eyes, I felt a presence suddenly surface from out of a wall. It wasn't a visible figure or a patch of shadow, but I could strongly feel it, approaching steadily towards my sofa bed. The feeling of horror was beyond how words can describe. I shrank my body, trying to move to one side of the sofa bed, as it was a natural human reaction. What horrified me next was, I felt it was sitting down right beside me, right on my sofa bed. It was less than 1 foot away from my face. I even saw the mattress being pressed down, just like if a person was to sit down on it. Almost simultaneously, the thing hugged over my body, and I could feel its weight on me, making it hard for me to breathe. I wanted to shout, to get up and escape, but I only found that my strength left me totally. In other words, my body was paralyzed. It wasn't a dream or hallucination. I was sure of this because my eyes were wide open. I just couldn't talk or move. 10 minutes went by, while I was strangled in horror. It didn't move. I could only hear the rain hitting on the glass windows outside. Together with the raindrops, I vaguely hear that thing whispering to me in a slow and deep sigh, "Aiutu." I couldn't make out what was the meaning, but I was concentrating on saying aloud in my mind, "By the holy name of Jesus Christ, I command you to go away." Then followed by the prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven." A minute later it disappeared. I found myself sweating, breathing heavily, and my heart was thumping fast. Coincidentally, the rain from outside had eased down into drizzles. Horror still filled the place. I never told anyone, especially my staff. Once words slip out from their mouths to my clients' ears, it would be my business's doomsday. Since that encounter, I placed a copy of the Holy Bible in that storeroom. Fortunately, nothing strange happened after that. Quietly, I started investigating the house by checking through every corner of the office for suspicious objects. One day I found a velvet-clothed round box in about 1 feet of diameter in one of the drawers in the bedroom. It was red in color. With extreme surprise, I wondered how there could exist a nice gift box in a hidden corner of the drawer. I still remember that the office was left totally empty at the time when I first moved in. No staff would usually trespass into this bedroom. Wouldn't it be left over by the last tenant? This was the first idea that flashed across my mind. It seemed a little weird for the fact that nothing was left over but such a nice gift box. All the other drawers were empty. With extreme care, I opened the box. Looking inside, I saw a piece of shattered porcelain in shiny black color. This escalated my curiosity to a newer height. Why on earth such a nice velvet box was used for a piece of broken junk? The shattered piece measured at about 4 by 5 inches with some irregular shape. The thickness was of about half an inch. It was just like a broken piece picked up from a smashed vase. When I touched the porcelain, I felt an electric shock strike me. Sad, hollow, heart-rending, and poignant was how I felt. Then it came to me as an emotion of misery and discomfort, overwhelming my mind. It reminded me of the horror sleep paralysis experience from yesterday. The sadness that I received through touching the glass was the same as that of the thing when whispering to me over my body. Without a second thought, I threw the broken glass down the rubbish chute. I then later asked my property agent about the history of the office. She said, several years ago the last tenant rented this office for his shipping company. He was a Caucasian businessman. Later, they terminated the rental contract in a kind of hurry. Since then, the place has been abandoned for quite a long time. There were some potential tenants who came and viewed the office, but they all said that they didn't feel right about this place. Also, there was another fishy thing relating to this incident. From time to time, there were some overseas phone calls, late in the evening, looking for Mr. Mark Lawrence. And there were letters addressed to some Italian names, received at the office letterbox too. One time when I answered the phone, there was a Caucasian man with an Italian accent looking for Mark. I told him that Mark was the last tenant and he no longer stayed here. He was shocked and replied that that was impossible. He said that Mark had just answered his call last week with this number at about the same time, and he believed that his business was still operating in Singapore, right in this office. I almost fainted. We were both so confused over the telephone call. I regretted that I hastily hung up the phone because I didn't take down his contact information. I was hoping that Caucasian man or anybody who knows the whereabouts of my last tenant would call again, but my hope had gone in vain. What was it that pressed over me in that gloomy afternoon? What was it trying to tell me? What was the broken porcelain piece that I recovered from the drawer? All of these remain as a mystery to me. Nevertheless, I moved out of the office a few months after that horror instance. I still think of these questions. Whatever it is, there seems to be no solid answer. I used to work at a 5-star hotel. I was a sales administrator there. While I was working there, I usually worked late. I always finished my work around 12 midnight. As I am so used to working late, I always think the night will be the same as yesterday, and so on. That night, as usual, I was working late again. I remember I was typing a contract that my manager needed tomorrow morning. While I was busy typing, I could feel someone behind me. Weird. I was all alone in the office. I turned around and saw no one. My heart was beating very fast, but I told myself, you have to be brave. You need to finish this blasted contract. You've got a lot of work to do. So I continue with my work. Suddenly I could smell something flowerish. Then, both of my manager's computers suddenly switched on by themselves. Guess what happened next? I heard someone calling my name from afar. By that time, I was really scared, but no matter what, I needed to finish the contract. Suddenly, my computer switched off by itself and the whole office blacked out. I screamed and started to cry. Someone was still calling my name. I cannot take this anymore. I packed my things and the contracts so I can bring them back home. I called my ex-boyfriend, telling him, please, talk to me until I reach home. By that point, I was running towards the lift. While I was waiting for the lift, I saw a figure, so I recited some prayer words. After that incident, you would think I would not dare to work late night again, but I still work late. And that incident happened again and again, until I finally said enough is enough. From that night, I started to bring my work back home. But still very weird, every time I left my desk, I will organize my work for tomorrow and always keep my desk neat. When I reach work early in the morning, my desk is in a mess. I keep on asking myself, is that a ghost who's been disturbing me? Maybe it is, but I'm so happy that I decided to quit my job. Although, it is not so easy to find a job now. I'm a paranormal investigator, based in the southwest of the UK. Me and the team went to investigate one of the UK's most haunted cemeteries, Charlfield, to see if it lived up to the hype, and I went from being a skeptic to a believer. It started out very quiet, with little to no activity happening, but as the night went on, we began to hear footsteps following us throughout the graveyard. Our walkie-talkies would make a static noise on command as a response to any questions, and whatever was there would make the light on the walkie-talkie activate when asked to. Towards the end of the investigation, we started to get a deep voice come through on our spirit box, and I started to feel really lightheaded and faint, so I passed my camera and equipment to my friend, and a split second later, I woke up outside the cemetery grounds on my own. Completely lost time. I made my way back to the cemetery, and my two fellow investigators explained that I had been acting strange for a good 40 minutes and walking around the cemetery with no torch. It was early hours of the morning, with no ambient light or street lights, so it was pitch black, and navigation was impossible without a torch. As you can imagine, I was a little bit shaken by this and had no memory of the event, and as I edit all our videos, I got to see exactly what happened to me, which was terrifying. Something possessed me that night, and if you watch the footage of our investigation, you can see my eyes are just pure evil during this time. That night I got home to go to sleep, and I could see a dark shadow in my room of a tall creature just moving and hovering over me. The fear was indescribable. Scratching noises and banging on my walls persisted for a good 2 weeks before stopping and never coming back. This was the third episode of our very first season. I made sure to put some protection in place for all future investigations, but this is the most terrifying event that ever happened. Thanks for listening. Just to preface, I think it's reasonable to try and medically explain my own personal experience. I'm going to explain things as they happen, and include a few bits of hearsay from others. So, I was a Navy corpsman, stationed in Okinawa for almost 3 years, an island south of Japan. Famously, it was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Right now, it's what we call the tip of the spear, having 6 Marine bases and an Air Force base. It's basically the launching point for any shit that starts off concerning China and North or South Korea. I'll also state that I do have an interest in the paranormal or supernatural, so maybe that interest paints the memory in a biased light. This was sometime in 2015. My whole time there, I would rotate between the emergency department and the fire station where I functioned as a paramedic. It was just me, a tiny little Japanese ambulance, and a bunch of Okinawan firefighters. This particular incident happened at Camp Hansen, the second furthest base from the Naval Hospital. One night, around 2 a.m. on a weekend, we get dispatched to one of the barracks buildings. I think the report was head injury. Anyways, I arrive in the stairwell to find a young Marine on his back, being restrained by 10 people. Multiple people per limb, and at least one holding down his head. This guy's head was covered in contusions that were already nice goose eggs. His eyes were rolled back. All I could see were the whites of them. He was pushing his chest up, about as hard as he could. And when he wasn't biting the air and gnashing his teeth like some sort of wild animal. He was screaming, "Make it stop," over and over again. They had his head forced down because he kept trying to smash the back of it against the ground. While we do our best to get him on a spine board and restrain him on it, I get the story from the witnesses. The guy had just been drinking a beer, talking to the Marine standing watch at the quarterdeck. According to the guy he'd been talking to, he seemed normal, like his usual self. Then according to the witnesses, he suddenly and out of nowhere walked over to the stairwell next to them and began screaming and slamming his face and head against the stairs, which is where all those contusions came from. They made it sound like it was a very abrupt change. For me, I'm in work mode. It's definitely strange, but I didn't get any, weird vibes. Just sort of processing it all as bizarre while thinking in the back of my head, didn't someone else mention they responded to a similar call just a few months ago? Someone told me they responded to that exact barracks building for a guy that was acting possessed. Similar story. Guy turns on the drop of a hat and becomes violent, and they have to tie him up with paracord while he's screaming, "Get it out." I later asked my firefighters, most of whom don't speak a lot of English, and they made it sound as if this happened a lot at that barracks. Anyway, I have the guy in my ambulance. He's fully strapped down, handcuffed to the spine board, and I have the staff sergeant there who says he was the guy's NCO from their last duty station. He described him as a pretty straight arrow. No history of trouble with drugs or substance abuse. Now, trying to rationalize it, there were drug problems with Marines on the island. Mainly Tylenol with codeine you could get over the counter at Japanese stores we weren't technically allowed to be in. And spice. Lots of spice issues. It's a synthetic cannabis that was also over the counter. It's typically laced with all different sorts of shit to get around bans. One ingredient in a brand is banned, so they mix up the formula and put it back on the shelves. I'd responded to a spice-linked call once. Some sweaty and spaced out guy in a post office. This didn't seem like that, but what the hell do I know? Anyway, the only way I can get this guy to sort of calm down is, and I don't know why I thought of this, but I just sort of moved the big plastic strap of the blocks securing his head over his eyes so he couldn't see. Kind of like how you see them do with alligators. I figured less stimulation is best. It works, sort of. He just kind of grunts and makes the occasional noise by the time we get him to the ER. Or maybe he's just tired himself out. Anyway, we get there, and it's Holdall City for him. He's sedated and the ER does its thing. I don't know what ultimately happened to him, but I do remember that one of the diagnoses ended up being rhabdomyolysis. Basically, muscle tissue breaks down and releases myoglobin into the blood. It can cause kidney damage, and when your kidneys shut down, you can become confused. If I wanted to explain it that way, I could, but to my knowledge, that's just not how it works. Infection and organ failure related confusion just doesn't happen that quickly. Not in the way the witnesses described. Could he have had some underlying psych issue? A mental break? Maybe. Schizophrenia? Perhaps. But it doesn't explain the apparent trend of incidents for that building. None of the other barracks had that kind of history to my knowledge. By the time I'd handed off the guy to the ER, I felt a little weirded out. But I was actively thinking of the other story I'd heard. I'm talking to the ER physician, and I sort of made a comment about not thinking it was drug-related. And he basically just gives me a look and says, "You're an idiot. Go back to the station and get some sleep." So I just kind of forget about it. I did not follow up on what happened to him, although I easily could have. I'll end this by saying there's at least one other bit of paranormal type stuff I was aware of. The barracks building next to the one I was in apparently had a problem with sleep paralysis. It was building 5704 if anyone's familiar with Foster. I'd hang out with Marines at the smoke pit, and quite a number of them reported that they experienced sleep paralysis. And one of them mentioned seeing dead Japanese girls in his room when it happened. Fun stuff. Anyway, that's the story. I tried to be blunt about it. Sorry if it's not as descriptive as it could be. Like I said, I was kind of in work mode. Okay, this is a story my mum hates to tell because it scares her that much. I already forgot a lot because it's been a long time since the last time she told me the story. She always says she does not want to speak about it. I don't believe in the supernatural, but my mum seriously gets scared every time she tells this. So I find it hard to not believe her. I already have goosebumps writing this. There was a man in our village that apparently got possessed by his own dead father. And one night, he went out drinking. At around 3 a.m, he went home, and on his way home, he started to break every window he saw. He also walked through the cemetery. Anyways, when he got to my grandmother's house and started to do the same, break windows, my grandmother, uncle and his wife, and my mum came out. They knew him and thought he was drunk, so they started to talk to him. His hands were bloody because of the broken glass, and his voice was growly and low. They tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. Once my mum got closer to speak to him, he told her to back off with his normal voice. He said that because she was pregnant with me at the time, and somehow my mum being pregnant was able to bring him out. I don't know. My mum fainted because she got weak out of nowhere after he told her to back off with his normal voice. His voice got growly and deep again afterwards. Then, when my mum woke up, she saw him literally crawling up a palm tree my grandmother had in their garden. She said he was crawling the tall tree extremely fast and looked like an animal crawling on his fours instead of using mostly his arms like normal humans do when climbing. I don't remember what happened next, but when the sun rose, he started to speak normally again, and apparently all his wounds from the broken windows were healed, and he had not even a scar. Also, he could not remember anything. He then went to a priest who told him he had to do certain things to get rid of his father's spirit. If I remember correctly, he had to walk through the cemetery for a couple of days at an exact hour. When I was 15, my mum got really sick. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling or sleeping. She would eat like a toddler, picking at things with her fork. We didn't know what was wrong with her, but eventually, since she would barely eat and was becoming more of a recluse, my dad took her to the ER. She came home and went to a specialist the next day. My dad picked us up early that day and took us home, not sharing what happened until we got home. My mum had stage 3 terminal cancer in multiple areas of her body. She had been completely fine 3 months before. We went on with our lives as we all worked through this with my mum. Our pastor told us he had friends who ran a Pentecostal church a couple of hours away, and that maybe he could help us as he had tried everything he could. We decided to make the drive since we didn't have anything else to lose. This preacher knew we had arrived, despite not knowing what we looked like, our names, nor when we were coming. So shortly after we sat down together in a pew, he asked my mum to step forward. We all stood and followed her up to the front of this church, with 200 people staring at us. My sister and I were taken to one side of the altar by 2 older women, and my mum, dad, preacher, and 9 or 10 other people were opposite us. They started talking to my mum, and up until now I have no idea why we were here. The 2 women were talking with us their arms around our shoulders. I heard over their voices growling, screaming and profanities being spewed into the air by someone. It sounded like my mum's voice, but like she was using something to distort her voice. I looked at my mum for a moment, only to realize I wasn't looking at my mum. Yes, same hair, clothes, height and weight. It was my mum, but something had taken her over. I could see it. Her face was distorted as if something was trying to escape her. Her eyes, very, very dark, despite being bright blue any other time. Her smile was large and unnatural for her. In that moment, I realized it was my mum making all those terrible sounds. Finally, it seemed the darkness that had overtaken our lives was gone. My mum was sitting near the altar. I walked over, hugged her and sat down next to her. We talked for a few minutes, my dad and my sister coming to join us. People were leaving, and as we were getting our things together, the preacher and his family came to invite us to dinner. That night my mum ate a large pizza, salad and an order of 8 wings and breadsticks, all on her own. It was the most she had eaten in a year. The next day, Monday, my mum went to be seen to check the progression of her cancer. That day, she found out every single speck of cancer was no longer plaguing her body. She was as healthy as she was before this started. We haven't had an issue since then, and I'm 27 now. The demon who made himself known as Seth tortured my mum for years before this incident, coming in and out of her life. Hopefully, he's gone for good. A bit about me. I'm 20 going on 21 and I'm a first generation medium. When I was a kid about 9-10 years old, I lived in an old 2-story house with the paint chipping on the outside, and the backyard was a 10-acre bamboo forest that was dense. One night, I woke up a little after midnight, having to use the restroom, and when I went to go open my bedroom door, I noticed it wouldn't budge. I checked to see if it was locked. It wasn't. So my next guess was that my brother, who was a few years older than me, was on the other side of the door holding it closed. So I banged on the wall between his and my room, and he yelled at me to go back to sleep from his room. Immediately after I heard him, I started pounding on my door, trying to get some help, and after a few minutes, my mother woke up and tried to open the door, but she couldn't get it to move either. She even went as far as unscrewing the doorknob, but still, it didn't work. I guess I passed out sometime, cause I don't remember what happened after that. A few nights later, I woke up between 2 to 3 a.m., needing to use the restroom, and I was in there for a few minutes, so I had some time to wake up, and when I got back to my room, I instantly felt something was watching me. I slowly looked towards my window, because out of the corner of my eye, I could see that it was opened. When I moved in my room a little bit and was able to fully look out the window, I froze. My room is on the 2nd floor with nothing under the window for 25 feet. Yet, something was staring me dead in the eyes. I couldn't move. After a few seconds, I was able to dive behind my bed to try and avoid it. I've never seen anything like it. It had a rotting, bloody face, with glowing yellow eyes and a dark grin. Again, I passed out. The next couple of nights after I saw it, I wasn't able to sleep in my room out of fear, so I slept downstairs, on the futon. That was a mistake. The 3rd night I slept on the futon, I woke up outside, deep in the middle of that bamboo forest, covered in dirt and leaves. After, I got up and tried my best to get back to my house, but when I got back, the cops were there because I was reported missing. I somehow got out of the house without unlocking any of the doors or windows, and without setting off the alarm. A few months after that, We moved out of that house and I started seeing things that I couldn't before. I know it's still following me, or rather, something is. Ever since the original incident, I've been getting more involved into the paranormal and metaphysical, and I've come to realize many things, but many things are still left unanswered. The one thing I did learn is the identity of the demon, and a little bit about why it was after me. The reason why it was after me. I've had this confirmed by a few psychics, but I apparently have a dark spot in my soul that was placed there when I was about 9-10, which aligns with the original incident. But ever since that happened, I've been able to see things and sense things that other people couldn't see, and I could do things as well. But recently, after about a year of having a ward placed in my house to keep everything out, I took it down just to see if anything would happen again, and right as rain, something happened the next night, and the night after that. A few days ago, I started feeling like my body wasn't completely my own, like as if I was watching from the sidelines. I could see my life playing out. It almost feels like something else has made a home out of my body. Any advice or help is appreciated. I have relatives in Malaysia, and I recently went for a funeral there. This story was told to me by a relative when he saw the same priest that was performing the rites for my dead relative. He said this same priest performed rites for another guy in Kedah, in Malaysia, and something epic happened, which even this priest told them that it was the first time he witnessed such things. By the way, my relative was at both funerals. Just some background. Funerals in Malaysia usually last 1 night or 2 nights, and the rites are long. It is not uncommon to stretch until 2 or 3 a.m. So, for this other funeral, the priest and relatives were calling back the spirit at about 11 p.m. The streets were quiet and there was no wind. They tried a few times, but to no avail. After more than a few times, suddenly the dogs on the streets whined and barked, and the winds suddenly blew strongly. Exactly at this moment, one of the relatives, a young guy in his early 20s, suddenly jumped up. They were all kneeling down, and shouted, "She's back." He knocked into all the others who were kneeling down. He then ran into a room in the house and was apparently shaken. The rest ran into the room to check on him, and suddenly this guy was possessed and spoke in a strange tongue. 4 to 5 strong men tried to subdue him but couldn't. The priest then realized that this guy was wearing a Buddha pendant or amulet on his neck, the type where there's a Buddha in the box, and he pulled it out immediately. The guy then collapsed and fainted, but woke up shortly after. Just when everyone thought it was over, and the priest was explaining that this guy committed a sin by wearing Buddha pendant and kneeling down in front of the deceased. Buddha is a god and shouldn't kneel down to people. That's why he was possessed. This part I'm not sure, so I want to hear what you guys say. Back to the story. When the priest was explaining halfway and everyone was taking a rest, suddenly the mum of the guy who was possessed went to the coffin and shouted loudly at the corpse. She shouted, "You are dead, and you shouldn't come back to harm the living." The priest rushed outside the house to the coffin to where the auntie was, and immediately used his gear to contain the situation. The rites that we see on TV the priests usually do. This auntie then calmed down and fainted. After all these happened, everyone was scared, and nobody really dared to do anything. The priest then explained what was going on. He also asked if this family were praying to a master of sorts, because this auntie was possessed by a master, and the relatives said yes. Note that this family weren't from this Malaysia state, and this was the first time they met the priest. The priest wrapped up the rites, and got everyone to sit down and explained what happened. He said for the first case, the young guy, he shouldn't wear a Buddha pendant and kneel in front of the deceased, and reminded everyone, next time don't do the same thing. As for the second case, the auntie was too overwhelmed with emotions when she saw her son being possessed, and this invoked the master to possess her. The other night I was talking with friends and was reminded of two stories that happened to me involving apparent doubles of people I knew. Probably about 10 years ago, my friends and I were playing a game I made up in a large local cemetery. The game involved one team with flashlights guarding a MacGuffin object. Usually it was a dim red blinking light I had, like something you'd wear at night jogging or cycling. The other team would try to sneak past the guards and retrieve the light. Basically hide and seek meets capture the flag meets flashlight tag. We had just finished a round, and we were gathering around a large tombstone where the light was sitting when the game ended. We were calling out for the hiding team to come out. The game was over. Most of the 7 or 8 of us playing were there. We were just waiting on Dan. I was looking around and spotted him in silhouette in the near distance. The cemetery is on a hill, and the backside of it is mostly set against a steep drop-off, with one of the paths running along the edge. This night was pretty bright with moonlight and light pollution from the town, so it was pretty easy to pick him out against the sky as he walked down the path. "Oh, there's Dan," I said to the group, pointing. Right after I said that, Dan came walking up from my right. I was so taken aback at this sudden appearance, it took me a second to look back up where I saw the person walking. Obviously, the figure was now gone. This admittedly may not be a paranormal experience but a creepy encounter with a person. But here's a few reasons it may well be paranormal. I was completely sure it was Dan. When you are good friends with someone, you can recognize their gait and posture as they walk. This, combined with the figure's body type and hair, matching Dan perfectly, made me totally sure I'd spotted him. The other reason I don't think it was a person is that they would have had to walk back the way they came, clearly visible against the sky, or past us, under the cemetery office lights to get out of the cemetery, as they were walking into a back corner. It's possible they just walked off into the woods, but I doubt they could have walked down the steep, densely wooded hillside quietly. Our investigation over to that part of the cemetery, of course, didn't turn up an explanation. Now, for the second story, which I'm confident in claiming is paranormal. I worked at a Sears in my town in 2013 as a warehouse worker. One of my jobs was to stock items, clothes, tools, etc., in the main warehouse in the back, or any of the smaller stock rooms around the store in different departments. One stock room in particular always gave me and my buddies the creeps. I was never sure why. It was pretty big, more or less dividing the clothing and soft lines departments from the tools and appliances. The inside of the stockroom was divided in two. One was the storage for the shoe department, with sliding ladders like a library to get to all the shelves, and you could walk through from the shoes entrance and exit out a door in appliances. The other side was sectioned off by a chain-link fence with shelving attached, and this part, for children's clothing, only had one door in and out, even though you could see through the fence to the other side. When you walked in this room, the wall was on your right, and to the left was a long line of shelves with some folded clothes and some shirts on hangers. You would have to walk nearly the full length of the room before the shelf ended and you could turn to the left and access the rest of the stockroom. I was by myself, unboxing clothes, when I heard the door open. I was next to the door, but on the other side of the shelf. I looked up and saw the top of my coworker Jake's head above the hanging shirts. Since he was one of my friends that thought this room was creepy, I tiptoed quietly next to him on the other side of the shelves as he walked down the corridor. When he was almost at the end of the shelf, I jumped forward and yelled. And there was nothing in front of me. Although I was very positive I'd seen Jake's head above the clothes as we both walked to the end of the aisle, he wasn't in the room with me. I'm getting so wigged out, just remembering turning the corner to empty space. After a few seconds, the door opened, for real this time, and Jake actually walked in. He asked if I was alright because he heard me yelling to try to scare him, and now I looked pale and freaked out. I lied to my manager and said I'd finished stocking the clothes, so I didn't have to be in there the rest of my shift. I later found out from the assistant store manager, Irene, that she had once found a man who had a heart attack and died in the hallway to the restrooms. This hallway, of course, was where the door to the creepy stockroom was. When she was the manager of the shoe department, whose stockroom was adjacent to the creepy one, she came in early one morning when the store was extending its hours for the holidays. It was still dark out before they opened and she was sitting by herself, about to eat a quick breakfast. She heard one of the sliding ladders squeak, and when she turned to see who it was, 2 or 3 of the ladders were sliding back and forth, down the shelves, all on their own. Let me know what you guys think of these encounters. I just thought it was interesting. I've twice now seen figures that I was very certain were my friends, only for it to turn out to be thin air. When I was about 8 to 10 years old, I lived in a horrifying apartment complex. I will tell you one of my paranormal stories that really freaked me out. So I had just gotten to bed, and I had made sure my curtains were closed all the way because I was terrified of being able to look out of my windows while laying down. I always had a hard time of going to sleep, but that night was different. I fell asleep easily, but I woke up in the middle of the night, I think, because I couldn't check the time because of how scared I was. When I woke, I kind of squirmed around. Then I finally opened my eyes. I noticed it was really dark. Soon enough, my eyes adjusted to the dark, and that's when I noticed something. By my closet was something sitting down and staring at me. It wasn't a stranger. I know this person. It was my mum. But at the same time, it wasn't my mum. Because, for one, my mother wouldn't be in my room staring at me while I was sleeping and sitting on my bedroom floor. Also, it looked like my mum, but its eyes were off. My mum has the most vibrant, pretty blue eyes. It had eyes that were darker. Not too dark, but you could tell the difference. And it was looking at me like someone would if they're spaced out. It also had the most emotionless expression. My mum would never wear it on her face. It scared the crap out of me. I kind of shifted over, looking towards the window where it wasn't at, and so it couldn't see my face. I noticed my curtains were opened a bit, where I could see outside, which also scared me, so I closed my eyes trying to go back to sleep. Surprisingly, I fell asleep almost in an instant. When I woke up, no one was there. I didn't tell anyone about it till weeks later, and I told my mum during laundry when I noticed a shirt. It's the shirt that the thing was wearing. My mum kind of freaked out and told me to tell her stuff sooner. I want to start off by saying, though I have a history of mental health struggles, that I am not, nor have I ever been schizophrenic. I've never hallucinated, auditory or otherwise. In fact, all of the experiences I have had starting over 2 years ago began when I left a Christian cult and my mental health began to improve. Back when the experiences began, I lived in Mississippi, and as my kid had claimed since moving there, our house was absolutely haunted. Things moved, disembodied voices, often mimicking my voice or my then husband's, shadow people, visible orbs, and a lot of ghost cats. I thought leaving that house would be the end of my experiences. Wrong. While I have had many experiences over recent years, one stands out to me over the others, and it was witnessed by 3 other people. Right before the pandemic, my small family moved to Washington State to be with family who weren't involved in the cult. It felt like coming home, like I should have been with them all along, and generally, all around, the most positive choice I have ever made. To get on our feet, we lived with my aunt and uncle for several months until we could find work and a home of our own. My aunt and uncle actually run a pagan community and have a lot of Celtic imagery of deity figures from Ireland. To say their house had a lot of spirit activity is an understatement. I hadn't been in their door half an hour before things began to happen. Something poked my butt when no one was standing behind me, touched the shaved side of my head, and on more than one occasion, called me by name. All events with witnesses who also began to experience the same things. The most noteworthy experience I had there was the one that will stand out in my memory with crystal clarity forever. Myself, my aunt, my uncle, and my husband were all in their living room, a small room set to the side with their double wide, where we had gathered for the evening to watch some TV. The only one not present was my kid, Victory, age 11 at the time, who was in the library which doubles as their room, on the other side of the house. I was sitting in an easy chair when I look up to see my kid walking by the entry to the room to head into the kitchen. They locked eyes on me, and I instantly knew something wasn't right. For context, my child is on the autism spectrum. They don't like to make eye contact, and if they have to, they de-escalate the sensations by being a total goof. They didn't wave, they didn't smile, they didn't do anything but meet my gaze stoically and continue on to the kitchen. I can't overstate the not rightness I felt. I, at first, thought something was wrong, that they were upset. Understandably, they were going through a lot with the move and being shunned by our cult family members. So I got up to go do the mum thing, calling after them and hurrying to catch up. They could have only been a step or two ahead of me. I left the room, rounded the corner to face the kitchen, more words on my lips, and no one was there. I was confused. I saw them go into the kitchen, so I called out for my kid, and their voice called back from the other side of the house, still in their room, having never left. I went back to the living room and asked the others if they had seen Victory walk by, a little unnerved. My uncle said yes, as did my aunt. Tim said they had thought they saw them walk by, but paid little mind. So unless this was some weird shared hallucination, we all saw it. I have since found out that I am sensitive to the energy spirits give off, and apparently, as it runs in the family, unknown to me till now, spiritual gifts are inherited. They call me a baby medium, so I feel confident in saying that I know whatever spirit took the form of my kid did not do so maliciously. They wanted to be noticed, and it absolutely worked. In fact, most antics from spirits seem to be this, and I have come to accept that they are around me and my family, even after moving into our new apartment. I have other stories, but this one was the big one that stands out. I was no more than 8 years old when I saw it. Even my sister, 10 years old, saw it. We lived with my grandparents at the time, but my grandpa often liked sleeping in the living room because he often wakes up at night to pray at our tiny altar. We don't always close our bedroom door. Basically, the living room was next to our bedroom, and our bedroom was next to the bathroom. So we'd see if anyone were to go to the bathroom through our bedroom. One Saturday night, me and my sister stayed up late, watching TV in the bedroom. The only light in the house was in our bedroom, and my grandpa chose to sleep in the living room again. It was past midnight, so we thought everyone in the neighborhood was asleep. That was until we saw my grandpa walking past our bedroom. We both stared at him until he disappeared from our sight. Of course, who would be scared? It's your grandpa. But for some reason we had chills because he never came back out. We assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, but we never even heard the door close. But what creeped us out was how unusually straight he walked, as if he was marching like a soldier. And a bit slow too, like he's trying to scare us. It was a bit dark, but we knew it was him because of his features. So we called out to him. The first few calls had no reply, so we raised our voice so he could hear us more. This time, he came to us. But what shocked us was that he emerged from the living room instead of the bathroom. Note that my grandpa often wears all white clothes when he's at home. It didn't hit us that our grandpa was wearing colored clothes that day, and not all white. The one that we saw a while ago was wearing a white sleeveless shirt and white shorts and was barefoot. That scared us even more. We asked our grandpa if he went to the bathroom just now. He said no, and that he was asleep. It was impossible for him to have pranked us because there was no exit through the bathroom. The windows there are all barred. We immediately told him about what we saw. He went to check but saw nothing. We were scared kids. We didn't know what doppelgangers were until then. Our grandpa talked to us about doppelgangers. He said that's probably what we saw, that it was kind of well known in our area. And he told us that if we see any more doppelgangers, like paranormal ones in the future, then we should immediately tell the original person about it. Because if we don't, then something bad will happen to them. Me and my sister never forgot about it. I would also like to share an incident that occurred a few years ago in a different part of my country. I forgot the exact details, but it was on the news and all over social media. A young couple was killed in a motorcycle accident. I believe a bus ran over them. But what triggered everyone was what the townsfolk said. They said that last night they saw the couple riding their motorcycle wearing the same clothes. But what shocked them was that they were headless. I don't know if it's real or they were just exaggerating, but the first thought everyone had was doppelgangers, and no one knew who it was because they didn't have their heads. That was until people recognized the clothes the dead people were wearing the next day, except the couple still had their heads, but their bodies were contorted in various ways that they assumed that was the bad omen the doppelgangers brought. That story reminded me of what I saw when I was a kid. A year ago, I made a post about me and my sister seeing a doppelganger of my grandfather when we were kids. Just today, something reminded me of another doppelganger incident I experienced and thought I'd share it, because it scares me to think that maybe, just maybe, it had something to do with my dad getting hospitalized. I'm not superstitious, but I just got chills thinking about the what ifs, you know? So anyways, a year or maybe the same year, I forgot. I was up late. I think it was around 1 or 3 a.m. I went downstairs to use the bathroom. While walking down the stairs, you can actually see the archway to the kitchen, and I thought I saw my dad. just standing there. I couldn't see his face because he was facing the kitchen, and when I almost approached him, maybe arm's length, he suddenly walked forward into the bathroom and closed the door. Note that the bathroom door is in the kitchen. So I didn't say anything and just waited for a while outside the bathroom for him to finish. I later found it a bit odd that he didn't turn on the light in the bathroom. You should be able to see if there's light from the large gap at the bottom of the door. No sound either. But I heard a clang in the bathroom like metal hitting something. At first I assumed it was the toilet flush handle, but I didn't hear a flush. You know that eerie silence you see in horror movies? 1 second there's the sound of wind and crickets, and the next there's nothing. Like the movie's telling you something's wrong. That's what I felt. There was this eerie silence after that metal clang sound, like pure eerie silence. My breathing stopped for a bit. I was caught off guard. It wasn't a long silence, more like a few seconds. But to me, it felt like time stopped for a minute. I'm not exaggerating. I called out to my dad, but I shit you not, I was actually scared to call out, and something else might answer back. Because I swear, the ominous feeling I felt at the time was bad. I never felt that before. No response. I called a second time, and this time louder. Still no response. I went to the bathroom door, only to find it wasn't even locked. I opened it and checked, only to find out there was no one there. That's when I realized that the person who I thought was my dad, that was arm's length in front of me just a moment ago, wasn't even my dad, because my dad has the same height as I do. I was so unfocused earlier that I didn't realize how different the one I saw from my dad was. I stared blankly for a while by the bathroom and ran up to my parents' bedroom, only to find my dad and mum fast asleep on the bed. Whatever it was that I saw had a similar haircut as my dad, and it was taller and wider. I confirmed that comparison the next day when I asked my dad to stand at the archway so I could reimagine the scenario. Also, the bathroom had no windows, just an exhaust fan. So if that was an intruder, it won't make sense for him to climb through the exhaust fan because that's like stuck in the ceiling. That incident was during the pandemic, so it was fairly recent. I told my family about it in the morning, and my mum told me just a few nights ago that she woke up in the middle of the night and saw me standing in the doorway of their room. She said she was half awake, so she ignored it. Then she woke up again, but this time I was standing by the edge of the bed, facing the wall. She fell asleep again and forgot to tell me about it in the morning. She didn't think it was anything weird at first because she thought it was me. I don't remember going into their room late at night, let alone standing like a creep. When we all told each other's story, we got scared. Well, a year later, my dad was hospitalized and got his limb amputated. He's diabetic. Things got out of hand and it was just the beginning of the pandemic. He didn't get immediate treatment from the hospital. His limb was in very bad shape, so in the end they amputated it. He came back home safely despite everything that's happening. And now he's doing well both emotionally and physically. Now the reason I was mentioning this in a paranormal encounter of mine is because I remember what my grandfather told me. It's actually a thing people believed in my country. Basically, when you see a doppelganger of a person you know, you have to tell the real person about it. But that's just what my grandpa taught me. It was only when I turned into a teen that I found out from the other locals that you have to hit the real person at the back of the head, or even just flick of your finger or knuckle, enough to make it hurt for them and not just tell them about the doppelganger, or else something bad might happen to them. Again, I'm not superstitious, but sometimes when you're in a panic or paranoid about something, you try to understand and believe it. I was thinking that maybe, just maybe, the doppelganger was a sign about what was about to happen to my dad. I know it sounds ridiculous. I'm sorry. I'm just blaming myself at this point. It might be anticlimactic or boring, but I was bothered for a while. After that night, I couldn't sleep because of whatever it is that I saw. Anyways, if anyone is listening to this, thanks. Glad you made it to the end of this long story. I will try and give as much detail as possible and keep this from going on too long. This happened back in the summer of 2015 when I was serving the United States Army Reserves. I was stationed in southern Alabama in a transportation company. Sometimes my girlfriend would come with me on the drill weekends, and we would crash at a friend of hers' apartment, which is where this incident took place. This particular weekend, we were in a large convoy in the middle of nowhere on some back road out in the sticks well over 100 miles from the city. That was when I got the most confusing, bizarre, and downright creepy phone call of my young life. She was in utter hysterics. She was crying and screaming, wondering why I would frighten her so badly, what the hell my problem was, and asking me how I even pulled it off. After I was finally able to calm her down, this is the story she relayed to me. Sometime that afternoon, her friend was at work, and she was at the apartment by herself. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, not a knock. After looking through the peephole, she saw me. But there was something off. She says I was wearing my army uniform. It looked like me, but that I had this very angry, aggravated look on my face. She opened the door, wondering why I was home so early, and apparently, without saying a word, I angrily blew past her, shoulder-checking her into the wall, and quickly walked down the hall, taking a left into the bedroom, and slamming the door behind me so hard that the whole place shook. She was very alarmed and confused about why I was home so early and in such an agitated state. I mean, that is so out of character for me. I'm not a violent guy at all. On top of that, if something did happen to set me off, she would have been the first to hear about it. So she's walking behind me, trying to get some information out of me, and she opens the bedroom door behind me and sees the closet door slam shut. She proceeds to run over to see what I was doing in her friend's closet and claims that when she opened the door, it was completely empty. That was when she had a panic attack and called me. Imagine my shock and confusion hearing that story, knowing that I was well over 100 miles away at the time. She finally believed me after I sent her a photo with my current GPS location, which only served to freak her out more. I thought that there must be some kind of rational explanation for what she saw. I will be honest and say it, she did smoke a little weed here and there, but at the time I know she was sober. She did not mess around with hard drugs or drink, and she had no mental illness of any kind. Over the years, since that happened, I came to learn about doppelgangers. I don't know what they mean, what they represent, or why they come around. All I know is that they are creepy as shit, and a girl I dated for several years came face to face with mine, and it put the fear of God into the poor girl. Take from this story what you will, and honestly, I don't care if anyone believes it or not. I just have to get it off my chest. The first time this happened was when he was 3. My older sister was staying in my apartment and watching TV in her room when my son walked in. She asked him if he wanted to watch cartoons and put some on for him. He just sat quietly at the end of her bed while she tried to get his attention. Then, she hears him laugh in the other room with me. When she looks to the bedroom door, the copy of my son disappeared. When she told me this, I assumed she was high and imagined it. Second time, a friend visiting from the UK got up at night to use the restroom and saw my son's door was wide open, lights on, and he was sitting at his little table with a friend. He told me about this in the morning, since it was 3 a.m. and kinda weird. My son wasn't in his room that night, and no other children were present. I rationalized it as he was tired and imagined it. The third time was when my son was around 8. My best friend and roommate, new apartment, different state, got up to go to the bathroom. The hall light was off, and it was dark, but she saw my son standing in the hall next to her. She told him to go back to bed and stepped into the bathroom. She then sees him in the mirror standing behind her and tells him to stop and to go to bed. My son then turns around and walks away. That's when she realized something was wrong and looked back into the hall, but he wasn't there. She goes to his room and he was still asleep. She ran to my room to tell me, and for the first time I thought, okay, there seems to be a pattern here. Maybe there is something going on. The last time was when my son was 15. This time I saw it. I was in bed, depressed and tired after having had a miscarriage. I woke up to my son curled up in bed next to me. I thought he was just trying to comfort me, which was sweet. I sang a lullaby to him and pet his hair before it clicked. My son was 15 now. This was him at age 7 or 8. I froze and asked who he was. He told me everything was going to be okay. Then he got up and left. Everyone assumed it was blood loss that made me hallucinate. But I was wide awake. No one's seen my son's double in 5 years, but it's weird as hell. For some context, I was visiting my grandmother on my mum's side for the weekend. My aunts and uncles are usually there as well, and we always do that on the weekend to check up on her and see how she's doing. Now, for the entire day, I had the feeling I was being watched or followed, but for the sake of not creeping anyone out, I just shrugged it off as paranoia. Around late afternoon, I went to wash my hair and was there for quite some time. Now, my mother didn't know that, so she was calling me in from the kitchen. Usually I'd be able to hear her, but after 10 minutes in there, it sounded as if the entire house had gone quiet, so I couldn't hear her at all. And my sister told her where I was, but she replied, "No, I just saw her in here. She was playing with the cats. She just passed me." When she told my sister that, she came by the door of the bathroom and told me what our mother had just said in a very confused voice. I was also confused because I'd only seen one of the cats all day and couldn't find the other one for feeding time, so I assumed he was in one of the rooms ignoring me because he did that a lot. Now, that was before I went to wash my hair, so around morning, going into the afternoon. After that, I hurried to finish up and went to the kitchen where my mother was. She looked up at me and said, "Why are you changed? You were just with the cats a few minutes ago." I shook my head and told her I'd been in the shower washing my hair, so I couldn't have been with the cats when she saw me. She simply shrugged and told me that she must have mistaken someone else for me. But as she said that, I felt a feeling of dread in the room. Now, I'm not sure if she was truly mistaken or if she really saw something, but I know my aunt had gotten mistaken last week thinking I was out in the garden with the cats when I was with my grandmother at that time. I don't know if I'm just paranoid and taking this too seriously, but I'm mostly worried for the cats because they were with me both times. Do you guys think the cats might be in danger if this really is an entity pretending to be me? Can it pose a threat to my grandmother as well? And if yes to either question, what do I do? One day I was doing some clothes shopping, and I got a call from my college friend, Jeffrey, to come over and hang out. I told Jeff that I would come over after I left the mall. I was using public transportation. After I get to Jeff's house, Jeff introduced me to his friend Sleepy, Sleepy appeared to be very sleepy and lethargic in the face. Sleepy and Jeff were in Jeff's room chatting about school. In Jeff's room, we hung out and talked for a while, but I had to go, so I decided to leave after about an hour. I shook Jeff and Sleepy's hands before exiting. As I exit Jeff's room and into the hallway, through the dining room, living room, and down 2 flights of stairs, I'm at the front door. As I slowly open the house's front door, I notice that someone is blatantly blocking my exit. I look into the eyes of the person who could be so rudely and purposely blocking my exit, and it's Sleepy. Now, I just left Sleepy upstairs seconds ago, so it would have been impossible for him to be at the front door trying to get in. Though I was in terror because I've lived a long life of ghosts, haunted houses and bad luck, my first complete thought was, this is Sleepy's twin brother coming to visit from home. Because I assumed with all my heart that this was Sleepy's brother, I extended my hand and welcomed him in. I shook his hand and it shook mine perfectly. He closed the door behind us. He followed me upstairs into the 2nd-story apartment, through the living room and dining room and into Jeff's bedroom where Jeff and his friend Sleepy were. Upon entering the room, I was so scared that I was trembling. I quickly sat down on the corner of the bed and gave Jeff a cigarette under the doppelganger's nose. I kinda handed Jeff the cigarette at the same time that the doppelganger entered the room, and the look on Jeff's face was terrifying. He was in disbelief. I looked to give Sleepy a cigarette too, reading him as well, but he didn't want one. I then turned to Sleepy, as he also sat, and said, "Sleepy, do you have a twin brother?" Sleepy shakes his head and replies, "Nah." As Sleepy stared at the doppelganger in the face, he seemed to almost cower, but he kept eye contact. The doppelganger was breathing furiously and was super strong. As it stared back at Sleepy intently, I watched him through the mirror because I didn't want to catch any eye contact from the doppelganger. I remembered to take note that the doppelganger had no reflection. After what seemed like an eternity, I slowly stood up and calmly walked out of the room behind the doppelganger and left the house. I have no clue how it all played out in the end. All 3 of our families experienced multiple deaths. Each time I saw Sleepy or Jeff in public, it slipped my mind to ask them how they got the doppelganger out of the house. I just want to make it clear that I am not an experienced writer. I have changed the names of the people involved to prevent any issues. There were issues in the past. I have been obsessed with horror and scary movies since I was 8 years old. When I was 13, I got heavily into creepypastas and just wanted to experience true horror for myself in real life. I am now 20 years old, and this incident occurred in the summer of 2018. I live in a small and boring town in northern Ontario. I had enough of watching videos and movies and decided to head to my local mall to pick up a Ouija board. It was springtime and the snow had just finished melting, and we were feeling adventurous. My friend Lenny and I split the costs of the board and then took it to his house. Later that night, we headed over to our local church and sat on the front steps and tried to contact some spirits. We moved a planchette in circles, called out, etc. Nothing. We tried the board for the next few weeks in various locations and settings. Nothing. I was beginning to feel defeated and sort of stupid for actually thinking a board could be used to contact the dead. Fast forward to the summer, and I had made a few new friends through Lenny and his girlfriend at the time, Sasha. One summer night we were discussing the Ouija board again, and I heard from Lenny and Sasha's sister that Sasha's house was haunted. I was skeptical at first, but Sasha went into detail on the experiences she has had in the house, and her sister, Tori, explained to me that this was all true. So I decided that if the board would work anywhere, it had to be here. Lenny and I asked the sisters if we could use the board at their house. They agreed, and Lenny and I were very excited to begin. We arrived at the house later that night, around 9 p.m, planning to play for only a couple of hours. Little did we know, this would last all night. The people present were Lenny and I, Sasha, Tori, and about 6 to 8 of Tori's friends who were younger than us by 2 to 3 years. We are all in the basement, and most, if not all of us, are gathered around the table. There are 4 or 5 of us with our hands on the planchette. We start calling out and just moving the planchette around, and we find someone. It claims to be a child who died in a fire inside the basement we were playing in. It told us its name and age, when it died, etc. I say it because we came to later find out that we truly didn't know what exactly we were all communicating with. A few minutes later, the board goes dead. Nothing. We all took a break and watched some videos on our phones on how to make the board more active. After discovering that we didn't have colored candles or a sacrificial lamb, just kidding, we decided to just continue as normal. My friend Lenny is very ballsy when it comes to this stuff, and he ended up calling out in the room to whatever was there. He was cursing and throwing insults towards the spirits and just overall being very disrespectful and cocky. The rest of the night, we all had random encounters with entities. The simple things like, I died here or there, I was this age or that age, etc. Until we contacted something strong. I say strong because the planchette would move with velocity and smoothness across the board. The air in the room thickened, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Around 10 minutes of talking to this entity, it still wouldn't tell us its name or place of origin. It mentioned that it wasn't born and that it wasn't from Earth. This is something I still think about today. Everything was going fine until Sasha screamed. She screamed with fear and pain in her voice, and her screams quickly turned into tears as she stood up from the table. Across her upper thigh were 3 distinct and somewhat symmetrical claw marks. One of Tori's friends mentioned something about the Holy Trinity, and everyone started freaking out. Lenny and I were determined to proceed with the session because neither him nor I was satisfied in our pursuit of true fear. We got back onto the board with Tori and 2 of her friends. Shortly after this, I asked the entity to show me what hell was like. The board spelled out TORICLOSET. Tori Closet. We all looked at each other, and Tori blurted out, "My closet." I stared back at everyone in silence until Lenny spoke up, saying, "Go into her closet. You're the one who asked. Now go see." At this point, I actually started to feel some real fear. Tori's closet was one of those shoe closets that you'd have to crawl into to go all the way in. I slowly creeped open her bedroom door with Lenny right behind me and looked back at the rest of the group as they stared in anticipation. Lenny shoved me into the dark room from behind and said, "I'll hold the door for you just in case." "Fine," I replied as I walked over to the closet. I got down on all fours and began to slowly crawl into the closet. That's when I heard a loud thump and felt a bump on the floor directly where one of my knees was. I stood up and ran as fast as I could to the door, and once I was back into the main basement room, everyone was staring at me. "What the hell was that?" asked Lenny. I was speechless, and while I was thinking of a response to Lenny's question, I realized something very disturbing. We are in a basement, so how did the floorboard bump up into my knee? What was the loud thumping noise? I headed back to the table and demanded answers to what had just happened. The board went dead again. No movement, no activity, nothing. I decided that We should all take another break so I could process what had just happened. This time Lenny and I went upstairs, and Tori, as well as a few of her friends, stayed in the basement playing with the board. 15 minutes later we hear some commotion downstairs, and Lenny and I rush downstairs to see two of Tori's friends on the board. The board was spelling out M-A, 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 M-A over and over again. The whole group decided that we wanted to pursue this strange entity even further instead of ending the session. This is where the night takes a turn for the worse. After 5-10 minutes of messing around and asking questions, we finally asked the question we never should have. Can we see you? The entity told us that it would show itself, but only on one condition: that the two girls who were originally playing after the break went into Sasha's room with the board in complete darkness. The girls agreed, surprisingly, and they went into the room and shut the door behind them. Lenny looked at me before moving over to the door and grabbing the handle and pulling the door so the girls could not get out. This was funny at first, but in the next 5 minutes, it was clear that something was deeply wrong. From outside the room, we could hear the girls telling the entity to show itself. Then, one of the girls cries out, "We can see it." 5 seconds after that, there is screaming and crying, and one of the girls calling out to the other one with concern and fear in her voice. Sasha yells at Lenny to open the door, and when he does, one of the girls rushes out. We all pile into the room and see the other girl lying on the bed. We shake her, and she wakes up looking very tired for some reason, like she was sleeping. 5 minutes after, I'm getting ready to drive Sasha and Lenny to his place for the night and head home. The girl from the room was complaining of a headache and was laying on the couch upstairs. On the way to Lenny's house, he asks me to stop at a store so he can get some snacks and drinks. I agree, and I stop there along the way. Lenny walks into the store and Sasha stays in the back seat of the car. A moment after Lenny left, Sasha gets a phone call from her sister, Tori. Tori was screaming through the phone. She said that we all need to drive back to the house because movie shit is happening. I quickly pulled out of the parking space, barely looking both ways, and sped towards the house. Upon arriving there was no commotion. I was confused. Tori came and got us and guided us to the couch that the girl was laying down on when we left. Tori runs up to us and whispers, "Shh, be quiet." Lenny and I were confused and asked what was going on. She told us there was something wrong with her friend. I slowly approached her friend, who was laying on an L-shaped couch in the fetal position, with her back turned to all of us. Just as I am about to extend my arm to touch her back to see if she's awake, her whole body starts to contort and twist. She moans loudly, and the moan soon turns into growls as I jump back in shock. I saw enough movies to make the assumption that she was possessed. Her friends wanted to call an ambulance, and Lenny and I knew that parents and the police might get involved, and it was a bad idea. We had to do an exorcism. I raced to my house to grab a few things before doing anything else. My parents are Catholics, so we had a cross and a Bible and even a mason jar of holy water. When I got back to Sasha and Tori's house, I found the girl still on the couch and knew we had to move her into the basement. We all held out our arms and made a human bodyboard to carry her on. While we were near the top of the stairs to the basement, she started twisting and contorting again, and most of the other people got scared and dropped her. She was now on the ground near the wall and the oven in the kitchen, and began having what appeared to be a seizure. Keep in mind, she has no history of seizures or health problems. She eventually sat up from being sprawled on the floor, resting her back against the oven. She sat still for a few minutes, and we all just watched, scared to approach. She then began smashing the back of her head against the oven until she fell over on her side. After that, she went back to laying on the ground. Eventually, we get her into the basement and rested her down on the floor, on top of pillows and blankets to prevent her from hurting herself on the floor. The next part is going to sound stupid, but it's the only thing we thought would help. Lenny started reading from the Bible while I splashed holy water on her, and the rest of the group just recited her name and some other things. She tried to bite us and was screaming in tongues and growling. She even scratched at one of her friends' faces. This went on from 12 to 3:30 a.m. Eventually she stopped moving, stopped growling, stopped everything, and just fell into a deep sleep. I decided to stay at the house, as everyone else did, just to make sure things were okay. I woke up around 4:30 a.m. with tightness in my chest and a very, very uneasy feeling. I grabbed my keys and ran out to the car and sped home before falling asleep. When I woke up, I headed back to the house. Everything was normal and the girl didn't remember a thing. Nothing at all. She had no headache or memory, nothing. She was just sore. I forgot to mention that a few people filmed a good part of the incident. We agreed to never show the girl the videos. However, someone sent it to a page on Instagram, and it ended up surpassing 100k views in a short amount of time. These are the issues I was talking about at the beginning of this post. She found it and lost her shit, and the video had to be removed. To this day, I haven't talked to her, but I hear she is doing fine. I still don't know much about MAMA. Its origin and agenda still remain a mystery to me. Part of me wants to know more, and another part of me wants nothing to do with it. In high school, a group of friends and I purchased a Ouija board to play with. We decided my house was the best, so the 5 of us sat around the board in my bedroom on Friday night and began to play. The board we got also was glow in the dark, adding to the spookiness. The first time was uneventful. The only entity we contacted, saying its name was No One. The second time playing was much more memorable and terrifying. It was only my close friend and I in my room, playing in the dark. Music playing softly on my stereo. We asked the basic questions and soon noticed our breath was visible. We were freezing. Now, my house was in the woods and my room was notoriously cold during the winter, so I turned on my space heater and we continued. No one appeared again, and still our breath hung in the air despite the heater going full blast. The radio began to jump stations, and the volume raised and lowered. Loud static filled the room, so I shut it off. The stereo jumped back on, lights flashing, country music blaring, even though we hadn't been listening to country. Unnerved but also excited, my friend and I laughed, asking no one more questions. Feverishly, the planchette flew across the board, sometimes right out of our hands. Besides predicting some minor events, we laughed off the encounter, and the Ouija board was put in my closet for safekeeping. The novelty had worn off, or at least no one wanted to play the board anymore. Some had bad dreams or just bad feelings. Meanwhile, I felt a dark presence following me, almost like an eerie shadow I could feel but not see. One night while in bed, the doors of my closet burst open, the radio blared on, and my lights flickered. This happened a few more times on various nights before my paranoia got the better of me, and I began to look up how to dispose of a Ouija board. Obviously, we had released something sinister. I learned burning it was a bad idea, so my next option was burial, deep in my parents' woods. So one rainy afternoon when nobody was at home, I took the board and a shovel and hiked deep into the forest behind my house. I dug a hole the best I could and buried the board deep in the mud. I had terrible nightmares for weeks, that I would come home from school to find the muddy board on my bed, but no such thing happened. My closet would still burst open, and the radio turn on randomly, and my room stayed freezing cold most of the year. For years I felt haunted and followed by something dark. It has subsided over the years, but I still have encounters. TVs turn on or my things go missing then suddenly appear. The encounters feel much less sinister than before, so I think whatever or whoever no one was, it wasn't good. I think the board opened me up to the encounters, but only the first felt dark, or dare I say, evil. I have found as long as I tell them I know they're there, the events stop. I'm not sure what I encountered or even if it still follows me now. It was 2008, and I was a freshman in college. My BFF, let's call her Kay, is 1 year younger than me and was still in high school. Most of Kay's friends are in my grade, so when we all graduated, she was left behind to finish high school, pretty much as a loner. One day I got a random message from Kay that said, "Hey, how's your mum?" I thought this was an odd question considering my mum was a homeless drug addict, and I wasn't exactly in touch with her, and Kay knew this. I asked why she was asking, and she proceeded to tell me that because she was so lonely and bored, she started playing with a Ouija board. First with a friend, then by herself. The ghost she was talking to claimed to be a teen boy named Caleb. Anyway, she was playing with the board, as usual, when suddenly it spelled out my entire name. Then, my mum's entire name. I didn't even know my mum's middle name, but Kay did. Then the board spelled drugs, drugs. Kay asked the board if my mum was okay, and the board started going crazy, spelling out M-A-M-A, M-A-M-A. And she got really freaked out and stopped playing, then messaged me. I immediately called my mum's dad, who was a reverend and retired pastor, and he prayed over the situation, which made me feel better. Kay started playing the Ouija board, and shortly after, a lot of negative things started happening to her. There was a bad car accident in front of the house she had the board at. She was driving, and our friend was airlifted, but survived. Kay failed a few classes and didn't get into college. Then she started drinking heavily and became homeless for a few years. She would see images of the devil everywhere, the corner of the room, in dreams, and even in cartoons. She was in a dark place for a while, but things are finally going better for her. I didn't talk to my mum for 10 years. Then a few years ago we reconnected and she told me about all the times she would try to get better, try and come visit, but something would always go wrong. She told me it felt like something evil had control over her life. She's doing better, and we talk now. There's a lot more to this story, but it's already too long. Thanks for listening. Okay, so about 10 years ago, I was an art major with a concentration in photography and would spend the entire weekend monitoring the photo darkroom, mixing chemicals for other kids, smoking weed, hanging out and working on my thesis. My college used to be some super rich dude's manor, had a castle on the grounds, and the majority of the original structures were used as the art buildings. Super old, super awkward staircases, weird-sized rooms, but super cool atmosphere. So I'm sure there had to be some serious history going on at this property. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but never had a good grasp of how interesting and dangerous it could be. During the first week of my freshman year, my grandfather died. I had to go home before making any friends, so nobody knew anything about me. Once I got back, we tried out a Ouija board and almost instantaneously the planchette darted between P and A, P-A-P-A, P-A-P-A. I called my grandfather Papa. Not a soul knew this. This is what got me to wholeheartedly believe in Ouija boards, and the start of me having a pretty good intuition of when my grandfather was around me, and even when he was assisting me. So back to senior year, a few friends and I decided it would be a good idea to bring the Ouija board into the dark room after all the students left. I was really the only one with experience, but I really didn't know shit. The second our hands touched the planchette, it was a garbled mess. I could tell there were many different entities fighting to converse. The girls who I was with there were immediately too scared to continue, and they just flipped the board without closing it out. And I didn't know enough to do it either. I had an overwhelming feeling that someone or something needed me to flip it back over. They wanted to come through. I told the girls that I would finish cleaning and then meet up with them at the bar in a bit. I was determined. I knew something was there, just didn't know what, and I really just wanted a sign. So with the lights on, I asked for a sign, asked them to move something, do anything. Nothing. I waited a little longer. Nothing. I was about to give up. Our dark room had this U-shaped hallway to get in and out. There was a definitive barrier between the light from the classroom and the dark of the darkroom. So, my dumbass took a chair and placed it right where the dark met the light. I yelled out for one more sign. This is your last chance, I'm leaving. Boy, was I not prepared for what came next. There was a radiator in the classroom that extended into the darkroom. There was a tiny hole drilled through the wall that allowed the tiniest of light to leak into the darkroom at the corner of the wall, directly in front of where I was sitting. I said one last time, "Okay, I'm leaving, this is it." And in that instance, a 10-foot black shadowy mass ran into the corner, completely blocked the small amount of light I could see, and ran right through me. I have never before and never since experienced that feeling when it passed through me. It was instant, full body chills. It was an overwhelmingly instantaneous fear that washed over me. I sprinted out of there without looking up. From that day forward, everything was weird. I felt my life force being taken from me. If anyone has seen Donnie Darko, it was kinda like when he could see his path. But that was my soul being taken away. I would be showering and go into trances and end up noticing I was washing myself differently, almost like a Native American in my grade school textbooks. It was all so bizarre. It's like I was losing myself to this dark entity. I tried to do another Ouija session afterwards. The spirit that came through was an Indian chief named Tanaka or Tatatanka. I don't know if this was real, or just my imagination trying to fill in the blanks or come up with something somewhat plausible to what I was experiencing. After a while, its power dissipated, and I started to feel normal again. But ever since then, I still feel as if it has bad intentions. Am I a vessel for a dark entity hell-bent on using me? Or am I just a nutjob trying to make excuses for some of the shittiest things I've done in life? I still see it lurking in the corner of my room. I was always such a pleasant, fun-loving person, but ever since then, I've had blackout rage that leads to me severely hurting my loved ones in one way or another. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas on what happened that day? And what, if anything, could still be happening to this day? Should I seek help? If so, from who? Thanks. One Sunday, about last year, my friend Jake and I wanted to do something fun and interesting. So we thought about doing a Ouija board. I got a sturdy piece of cardboard and Jake put the Ouija letters on it. We both thought it would be super fun or something. We knew about the stories of how they stay in your home forever if you invite them. And so, we went to a park, away from our neighborhood, and set it up there. My friend told me that we had to allow the spirits to control us in order to have it work. That kinda scared me. First, we would ask, are there any spirits who would like to talk with us? We asked that 15 times. It started to seem hopeless. Let's just do it one more time, and then we should just go home, I said. We asked again, are there any spirits who would like to talk with us? And then Jake moved the circle thing onto yes. I thought he was just being dumb because he didn't want to go back home. I was convinced that he moved it. Dude, that's not funny at all. Stop moving it, I told him. He looked at me with a serious face and said, I didn't move it. I thought you did. That's when I started to feel spooked. But it wasn't enough to get me away from there. Okay then, I'll ask it something only I know, I said. I thought about my room. I had an old, steelback iPod Touch at the bottom of my desk drawer, and I knew Jake didn't know about it. So I asked, what is in the bottom desk drawer at my house? And we spun the circle around on the board. It started to spell out I-P-O. I took my hands away and yelled, Jake, did you go through my stuff? He just looked at me in disbelief. You are pranking me, aren't you? He asked. That's when I realized this whole thing was real. We are talking to a spirit? Jake realized. Then we asked a bunch of stupid questions. Stuff like, what am I thinking? It would tell us correctly every time. We asked its name and it said John. Then we asked, are you a peaceful spirit? It said no. Then we asked, do you want to hurt us? The circle slowly moved to yes. Holy frick, man, Jake said. I don't want to do this anymore. Jake stood up. I was glad he said that because I felt the same. We tossed the board into a gated area and ran back to my house. On the way, we passed a person walking their dog. The dog barked at us like crazy. I've never seen a dog barking so loudly. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that spirit. I thought it was in my room. I don't know if I thought about the spirit enough to make myself feel it in my home, or if it was actually there. It was only a hint of presence I could feel, so it was unclear. A week later, I couldn't feel it anymore. And to this day, April 24th, 2021, I haven't felt it again. Don't mess with Ouija boards unless you want to screw up your life. We must have gotten lucky. When I was 10 or 11, my friend brought out a Ouija board at her house. I didn't want any part of it because I believed in demons, but my friend and sister thought it was funny and asked it how old I'd be when I'd die. It said 14. Then they asked how, and it said black car. About 3 years later, when I was 14, other friends, ones who hadn't heard about the board and didn't know that friend, started saying that they had dreams of me getting into car crashes or being hit while crossing the road. I immediately asked about the car each time, and they always said a black truck or a big black dark-colored car. Multiple friends said this, and when I told them about what the board said, they were freaked out. Some will think it was my sister playing an elaborate joke. But this was 3 years after the board, and she's not a prankster, and neither are my friends. At least one would have for sure spilled the beans because they are bad liars and bad secret keepers. Anyway, they had these dreams for months, and would tell them to me at lunch. Then another friend, who was in a separate grade, meaning she didn't eat lunch with us and didn't know about the dreams or the board's prediction, was talking to us when she turned to me and said something like, "Hey OP, I had a weird dream that I was at a funeral. Your siblings and parents were there, and we were all there, but you weren't. I'm not 100% sure whose funeral it was, but I'm pretty sure it was yours." This happened a few weeks before my 15th birthday, so I was freaked. Not long after my friend's dreams, my mum got a black car, and it made me even more scared. A big black Mercedes. Granted, there are a lot of black Mercedes cars in my town, but it still made me nervous. The weeks leading up to my 15th birthday consisted of me being extra careful crossing the street, and always wearing my seatbelt. I was relieved when my birthday came and passed, but it still haunts me. Such a bizarre experience. Others have suggested that maybe the warning from the board and dreams actually saved my life. And maybe that's true. I'm a freshman in college. I've had more than just one paranormal encounter, but this is by far the worst. I attend an all-girls Catholic school, and it's almost 100 years old with cemeteries on campus for the nuns we have. That's not relevant to this story, but I just wanted to provide details. Anyway, it was about 10 PM on a weekday when I started getting bubble guts. I had to use the restroom, and I mean use the restroom. I hate going number 2 in the restroom on my floor because someone is always in there. Before I tell you this next part, I just want to say that I've been doing this for a very long time and never had any problems until that day. I use the restroom in the basement. I promise the basement doesn't look like what you think it does. It looks decent, and it connects to the first floor via a small staircase. So I was never afraid. Not only that, but the restroom down there is pretty nice and clean. When the elevator brought me down to the basement, I walked in, getting ready to do my business. When I opened the bathroom door, I noticed a stall door was closed. I was surprised because in all my times doing this, no one was ever in here besides another freshman teammate of mine who did the same. Immediately thinking it was her, I peered under the stalls to see her blue Crocs. Except there was nothing there. No feet. I figured someone got embarrassed that I walked in and picked up their feet or something like that. I decided to leave them alone, and as I turned my back to leave, the toilet paper in that stall started getting yanked out. It was being pulled out so fast, it made its container shake, making a loud noise. My heart picked up its pace, but I convinced myself that someone was in there and was just now in a rush. I left and headed towards the elevator. After I pushed the button, the toilet paper stopped. It was taking forever, and just as I was losing my patience, I heard the stall door from inside the restroom fly open. It flew open, as if someone had kicked it open. At this point, I knew the stairs were the smart option. The stairwell is located right next to the elevator, so I wasted no time. I opened the basement door, and just as I stepped into the stairwell, the bathroom door opened. But again, as if someone had kicked it open with enough force to make it hit the wall. My brain was telling me that it was just a person who was in a rush, but my body didn't let me turn around to check. Just as I had made it up the first flight of stairs, the worst thing happened. The basement door that I had just walked through swung open, again, as if someone had kicked it open. Following that, loud, heavy, and fast footsteps were coming up after me, and they were moving quickly. I was afraid, but didn't let it get to me. I had already passed the first floor door, and I only lived on the second floor, so I started running. The other footsteps seemed to be echoing so loud throughout the stairwell. I was getting my keys ready to open my floor door. When I got to it, I unlocked the door while hearing the footsteps get closer and louder. I ran inside and bolted to my room door, the first door on the left wing. I put my back against my room door and waited. Just a second later, the same loud footsteps ran through the hall and sounded like they stopped dead in the middle. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my teammate pranking me, but there was nothing except the stairwell door closing. I ran to the middle of that area to look down the right wing hall, and there was still nothing. I still tell myself that this was just a person who was in a rush and just didn't see them. The sound of the toilet paper and the sound of the fast, heavy footsteps haunt me when I think about them. I'm uneasy and unsure about the whole incident. The only thing I'm sure about is that I'll never go back to that restroom again.
At my school, there's a toilet door that doesn't open. In the boys' toilet on the first floor, the innermost toilet stall. The door is sealed tight and doesn't budge at all. Some of my classmates say it's just a converted storage room or something. There are plenty of strange rumors about it though. It's eerie. Apparently, if you knock on the door, someone or something knocks back, even though there should be no one in there. If you ask, "Is anyone there?" apparently, you'll get a reply. And this is just a couple of the creepy rumors. All the kids at school talk about it. One day my friends and I wanted to see if there was any truth in these rumors, so as the sun set, we decided to head to the toilets on the first floor. There wasn't anything especially different about the toilets on this floor. They were the same layout and design, but there was something about the atmosphere that felt a little different. Perhaps it was our anticipation, but I don't think it was. The innermost toilet door, like the rumors said, wouldn't budge. We tried to heave it open, but it seemed like it was sealed shut. We tried going into the adjoining toilet stall and climbing up to get a peek over the top, but that bit above the toilet stall had been boarded up. We came to a dead end.
"Well, someone knocked then,"
one of my friends said. Another one of my friends, let's call him A, took on the dare. A approached the toilet stall and knocked. The bathroom fell into an eerie silence. It felt cold in there. For a while we waited for a response, but there wasn't one. We were kind of disappointed. "Try asking if someone's there," one of my friends called out to A.
"Is anyone there?"
The only sound we heard was the steady drip of the bathroom tap.
"Looks like the rumors were fake then. Looks like the rumors were fake then."
A said, while breaking the silence. We all laughed, and it eased the tension a little.
"Let's go then, guys,"
A said, and B started whistling some tune or other as we turned to leave. I didn't want to admit the impossible, but it sounded like the door opened. No one wanted to turn around.
"I think the door's open,"
A said. Still, none of us turned around. I was the closest to that stall. I tried to shake my fear off and began to turn to face it. At that time, my friend began to scream, and he ran out of the bathroom. A and I ran after him. We called up to him, and he was sat on the stairs with his head in his hands.
"What happened? Did you see something?"
A asked.
"There's something in that stall."
He said. What? I asked.
"Something like an altar for worshipping. It was covered in blood. Dry blood."
He said. Really? In a toilet stall?
"It's true."
We all headed back into the bathroom. We crept in side by side. I really didn't want to go back in there, but the other two did. When we got back in there, we found the toilet stall was shut again. Once more, we tried to heave it open, but it wouldn't budge. We went home, very confused. After about a week, my friend, the one who saw the strange altar in the toilet stall, approached me with the problem he'd been having.
"At night, no matter where I am, whenever I go to the toilet, someone knocks at the door. I asked my family, but they said they're not pranking me. Every night, I don't want to go to the toilet at night anymore. Something's followed me from that stall.
It sounded like whatever was happening to him wasn't going to stop either. Anyway, A and I are going to head over to his house tonight, try to see if we hear the knocking too. Hopefully, he's just hearing things, but who knows? Note: there have been no further posts by this author.
This happened in 1998. I was then working as a salesgirl in a boutique which sells Muslim, traditional ladies' clothes at Golden Landmark Shopping Centre, which is located around Arab Street. That night, around 9:30 p.m, me and my senior colleague, Shikin, were cleaning up and are about to close the shop. Shikin was 4 months pregnant at that time. As we were about to close, Shikin excused herself to go to the ladies. She went alone, but a minute later she rushed back looking pale and shaken. She told me to close the shop quickly and to go back home. So I pulled down the shutter and we made our journey home together. We take the same bus. As we were walking outside the building, Shikin revealed to me what she had seen a while ago. She told me that as she was about to enter the ladies, she saw a very pretty Malay lady who was wearing a 1950s style baju kebayas outfit and a selendang standing inside. The Malay lady was adjusting her selendang in front of the mirror. As Shikin walked inside, all of a sudden the Malay lady turned her head sharply and looked at her. The Malay lady's eyes were big, and she was staring straight at Shikin's eyes. Shikin was stunned on why the lady had to look at her like that. As they stared at each other's eyes, it was then that my colleague noticed that the Malay lady was wrapping the selendang tightly around her own neck, as though she was trying to strangle herself with the selendang. All the while her unblinking eyes continued to stare into Shikin's. Shikin found some courage to turn around and go back to the shop to where I was. There was really something not right about the Malay lady, and it frightened her. The next day I learned that Shikin was hospitalized, as she suffered from miscarriage. What was strange was when the doctor informed Shikin that the unborn fetus strangled itself with her umbilical cord. Shikin resigned after that, but I still keep in contact with her, and to this day, she still believes that the lady in the toilet had something to do with her miscarriage. The way the Malay lady wrapped her selendang tightly around her own neck seems to show the fate of Shikin's unborn baby. My mother says that the Malay lady was a Pontianak.
Last year, a branch of family-friendly places popular with NS men and soldiers was undergoing a renovation, but a portion of it was still opened to the public. There was one night, roughly after 9 o'clock. I needed to use the washroom. Me and my friend drove in from the car park, and my friend waited in the vehicle. I went in from the car park front counter, where there is a cash-up, top-up machine, and a security officer sitting behind his desk. I took a lift up to the second floor, or the third floor, where the Chinese restaurant was. If you guys could recall the layout, once you come out from the lift, then you turn right, and there's the Chinese restaurant. You walk further up, and there's a public washroom. During that night, I exited the lift, and all the air around me was still, and the area was dark. Nobody was on that floor, and the restaurant wasn't open. It was very quiet, and there wasn't any breeze. I proceeded into the public washroom, and unexpectedly, no one was in the washroom. I proceeded with my business, washed my hands, and exited the toilet, heading back to the lift. As I was about to reach the lift and press the down button, I heard very distinctly a door slamming behind me. Instinctively, I recognized the sound of the cubicle door slamming in the toilet. I froze for a second, but acted like nothing has happened, and I pressed the down button and waited for the lift to bring me to the car park. That slamming sound was heard again. It was as if someone was in the toilet slamming a cubicle door hard. The lift arrived, and I calmly walked in and pressed for the basement. As the lift door closed, I could hear the cubicle doors still being slammed. I reached the car park and asked the security guard whether anyone was on the second floor. He looked at me and told me that the premises is under renovation. No one's on that floor. I asked him whether he was sure. He looked at me again and asked if I was okay. So I replied to him there might be some activity on the second floor. And then he gave me a strange look. I walked back to my car, and my friend looked very surprised and commented that I looked quite pale, and I was drenched with perspiration.
One night, our parents went out, thus leaving my younger and I at home alone. That did not pose any problem for us, as we were used to it until what happened to us that fateful night. My brother and I decided to check out what was happening outside the kitchen windows. I cannot recall why we did that now. Nevertheless, neither one of us switched on the kitchen or toilet lights, but the kitchen was dimly lit by the light cast from the living room. All windows in my flat were usually shut when dusk arrived, and the main wooden door in the living room remained shut at night unless my father was home. We lived on the 9th floor. My brother and I were huddling together and fixated by what we saw downstairs at the badminton court from the kitchen windows. Normally this court was used for many various functions by the residents here, or the residential committee, for events like funerals and dinners. While being entertained, my brother and I suddenly heard a soft-spoken female voice emanating from the dark kitchen toilet on our right. She was calling out my brother's name. My brother and I got the shock of our life and scampered hurriedly to the living room like headless cockroaches. Once we felt safe, we looked at each other, puzzled at what had just happened. We decided to call our parents at this house where they were visiting. At that time, mobile phones were unheard of. My mum advised us to stay put and wait for them to reach home. Up till now, no one in my family could explain the phenomenon that my brother and I experienced. This story happens in a camp in the northern part of Singapore when I was still a recruit. Our bunk is on the 4th floor. The toilet was located next to the staircase. It was believed that someone in the past had hanged themselves inside the toilet. One night, my buddy and I went to the toilet. It was around 2 a.m. I had looked at my watch earlier before going to the toilet. The toilet is designed in a way that, on the right, if the entrance is the washing area where we washed our clothes, further down is the bathing cubicle. There is a long mirror on the left of the entrance. The urinal is straight in from the entrance. Along the way to the urinal are the cubicles for doing business. When we reached the toilet, we went straight to the urinal. Before we could finish what we were doing, my buddy and I heard someone washing clothes. The tap was running, and there was the sound of scrubbing of clothes. The sound was really convincing. We were shocked. How could there be anyone washing clothes in the middle of the night? We quickly finished what we were doing and went to have a look. The washing area was empty. We looked at the mirror and saw no one. We believed that ghost reflections will be seen through the mirror. Just when we were about to rush off, we heard someone bathing inside the bathing cubicle. Water was rushing out from the tap and splashing onto the floor. We immediately rushed out of the toilet and back to our bunk.
During my time in Tek Kong, I was in Mohawk Company, and there was this week which my company was scheduled for a round the island prowl. Kenna arrowed with a few others. I hadn't received my M16 yet, so I was assigned with a baton and a rattan shield. I tag-teamed with a buddy who recently injured his leg during training, so movement was a bit slow for him. There were 2 different time slots for the prowl, just after sunset and past 2 a.m. To cut a long story short, fast forward to the 2 a.m. prowl. I finished my prowl and went to the toilet in the jetty to wash up and fill up my water bottle from my SBO. It was a humid night and very sweaty and uncomfortable. The toilet was quite modern, with adequate lighting. There were 3 cubicles, which was behind me at the time, and I was facing the mirror and the basins. When I was almost done refilling my water bottle, I heard a sound from one of the cubicles. The toilet had flushed. The doors were half ajar, and since I stepped in, no one else came in. I ignored the flushing sound. Maybe I missed one of the guards, I thought, while looking at the mirror, which reflected the 3 cubicles. Whoosh, and then again a few seconds later, whoosh. 3 bloody flushes from 3 cubicles. Further to the first flush, I heard 2 others come from the other cubicles. Who the hell was in here? I asked myself. I finished topping up my water bottles, and I fastened them to my pouches, and then I heard another set of sounds. Like a clock, clock, clock sound, repeatedly and rapidly. I grabbed my baton and faced the 3 cubicles. One by one, I gave it a light kick to see what the hell was going on in there. There was no one in there. The flushing sound ceased, one after another, when I went in. I guessed that it ran out of water to flush, but that clock, clock, clock sound remained. I took a step forward and nearly went weak at both knees. Right in front of me, the metallic push button for the flush kept being depressed, and when extended, it was depressed again. I took a few steps back and saw all 3 cisterns' push buttons were rapidly moving up and down, like something or someone was in there, at the time pushing the buttons repeatedly. I grabbed my gear and I fast marched out of there.
This happened to my ex-colleague in my ex-company. She sat beside me in the office, and she is someone who is very interested in Feng Shui. One day, I saw a new Feng Shui item on her desk. Something that looked like a coin sword. Out of curiosity, I casually asked her what the sword was for. Then she whispered, "Shh, I'll tell you later. Got many people here now." I sensed there was something she was about to tell me. So later, when not many people were around, I asked her again. She asked me to come nearer, and she started to tell me the story. My girlfriend's boyfriend picked her up from work every day, but he always arrived at our office late, i.e. 9 p.m, because he worked far away from our office. So usually, my colleague would end up alone in the office. We used to work on another floor, but recently our department moved into this new floor. She said one night, she went to the ladies' toilet at the other end of the floor. While doing her business inside the toilet had the usual plastic cubicles inside, she heard a tapping sound from the next cubicle. Tap, tap, tap. So she came out of her cubicle, only half finishing her business, to check whether anyone was outside. Nobody else was in the toilet, and the tapping sound stopped immediately after she came out. So she went back to the cubicle again to finish her business. This girl dared to say, "Don't disturb me." She said she thought it better to give a fierce warning to show that she was not afraid. Well, she told me she's got the 6th sense, and a bit of a third eye. So she said she was not very scared about the supernatural stuff. Immediately after she went back into the toilet and continued her business, the tapping sound started again. Only then did she start to feel goosebumps on her neck. Soon, she felt something worse. Every cubicle had a light on top of it. She felt that the light on her cubicle slowly dimmed as though there was something floating on top of her staring down at her. So the entity probably covered the light. That was why the light suddenly dimmed. This girl pretended to be brave some more, although inside she was scared like crazy. She said she coolly finished her business, didn't wash her hands, but casually walked out of the toilet. Right after she opened the toilet door and walked out, she ran so fast like a madwoman to her workstation. She quickly packed and waited for her boyfriend outside the office. Since she had to wait for her boyfriend to pick up every night, she then started to avoid going to the toilet. But if she really couldn't hold it anymore and needed to go do her business, she said she tried to finish quickly and practically always ran out of the toilet. She would then hide at her workstation where she had put the coin sword to protect her from those supernatural things. Story 2. This was another colleague's friend. She told me about this story because I told her about my ex-colleague's toilet tapping sound. She said, tapping sound in the toilet again. And she told me that her friend also experienced something similar. But her friend worked in another office. That office was old and rumored to be dirty. Same thing, her friend went to the toilet. Inside the toilet, she heard a tapping sound coming from the last cubicle, which was next to her cubicle. According to my colleague, it is best to avoid going into the last cubicle in any toilets. Don't know how true that is. Anyway, back to the story. The last cubicle was already out of action for a long time. So definitely, there was no one in that cubicle because it had become a little storing place for brooms and pails, etc. But this girl also pretended to be brave. She dared ask, "Anyone there?" Of course, nobody replied. If someone replied, I think she would have surely fainted. She finished her business and came out. She washed her hands and went out of the toilet casually. Very brave girl, because she's not afraid yet. But then, the tapping sound actually followed her. Only then did she become afraid. At first, she thought that maybe the old building would have some kind of sound, but how can that sound follow her out of the toilet until she reached her workstation? Worse than that was, she started to hear as though there were many people talking. The next day she told her other colleagues. They said that maybe because she always stayed late in the office, alone, the people probably one fine night decided to invite her to join their party. I don't know whether to laugh or feel scared. Moral of the story? Don't be too hardworking and stay late in the office.
When I was in primary 6, my school had these 2 toilets, boys and girls, beside the hall, which were locked since I was in primary 1. Teachers said that these 2 toilets are damaged and beyond repairs, and at the time we actually believed our teachers. Here's what happened to me. I was helping out at the school hall on an activity when I felt that nature was calling, which is kind of an urgent call of nature, if you get what I mean. So I rush out into the hall, and to my surprise, the boys' toilet outside the hall wasn't locked anymore. Oh, I thought, wow, it's actually finally been repaired. I rushed in without much hesitation, and as I was in such a rush, I didn't bother to switch on the lights or the fans inside. I finished my business, and I went to wash my hands, but no water. I turned the lights on. When I turned right towards the door, about 10 meters away, the door slammed shut before my eyes. I was in shock, but I didn't dare look anywhere. I just ran straight at the door, and luckily, I was able to open it. I then ran to my friends who were still at the school hall and told them what had happened. They were all curious and asked me to show them, and they followed me back to the bathrooms to take a look for themselves. When we got back to the door was locked and unopenable.
For me, I think this is the only scary incident I ever came across. It was at my school, and I was currently in my math class. I had to go to the toilet, so I got the teacher's permission and went off. The bathrooms were on the same floor as my math class. Each floor in each block in our school has 2 bathrooms, boys and girls. I was on the first floor, middle. Anyway, I entered the girls' bathroom, and there were 2 cubicles. One was on the back wall, and another was in front of it. I went into the one in front of it, in hopes that nothing bad would happen to me, since the back cubicle was also in a cornered area, plus darker. When I went in, I heard sniffing sounds, as though it was a girl crying, around my age or older. I heard no tears or anything else, but just sniffs. I exited the cubicle and proceeded to wash my hands. Weirdly enough, I saw that the back cubicle door was open. When I first entered, I swear I thought it was closed. If the sniffing person went out, I heard nothing open, nor did I hear any footsteps then. I just ignored the cubicle thing and went to the sink. Strange, one of the mirrors had black stuff stuck on the bottom parts of it. And yeah, I didn't know what it was, so I avoided washing my hands around that mirror's area. I went to the mirror next to it, which was clean. The soap dispenser was also broken, so I couldn't wash with soap. I just wet my hands, dried them, and went out. I then suddenly ran into a cleaner by mistake. We both said sorry and then passed through. I went to return to my maths classroom, and then the bell went to mark the end of the period. I had another period of maths to go. When I told one of my other friends later that day, she responded that it could have been most likely a ghost. To me, I'm still totally unsure. What do you think? Girl or ghost? Like most children, Christmas was my favorite time of the year. The lights, the decorations, the snow-covered streets, and the chiming bells of the carolers. But the most exciting part, the presents under the tree on Christmas morning. However, there was one thing that I always didn't look for when Christmas time was getting near. It is a very particular tradition that is often shrouded from the excitement of the holiday and is forgotten, that is, until when its time comes. In Bulgaria, most people are quite superstitious and have small rituals that are often seen in a household and in their daily lives. For example, never celebrate your birthday prior to the actual date, for it's the same as if you were celebrating your death. Or tying a red string on your wrist to ward yourself against malevolent eyes and gazes. However, the most frightening to me as a child, and till this day, is the Dinner of the Dead. At least, that's how I call it. There is no doubt that in Bulgaria, Christmas Eve is probably the most important tradition. I dare say even more important than Christmas itself. Of course, to me, a child, it is the opposite. But the more I grew older, the more I realized why that was the case. Most families value tradition and the gathering of its members, so it is no surprise that a holiday solely based on such values to be always looked forward to. Most people see this as an opportunity, for once in our busy lives, to find time to spend with the whole family, to cherish it as some people have no one. to forgive and forget old grudges, and for once appreciate the life we have, the people who are still around us, and to drink for those who are not. A day of warmth amidst the barren and lifeless winter, and the busy and noisy life. When Christmas Eve rolls around, the table is always outstanding, as if my parents would pour their hearts and soul for every single dish. There would be a plate filled with cabbage rolls, meats of various kinds, from pork chops, sausages, and grilled meatballs. Various yogurt-based and vegetable salads would be scattered amongst the table, and every plate being decorated with silver cutlery and themed napkins. We would sit and indulge in our feast, while the television would often play some random music channel. The whole event was always beautiful and heartwarming. It is on such a day that the most suppressed and embarrassing moments would surface, causing laughter, joy, and oftentimes a cleansing sensation of the soul, as you are parted with long-time memories that were stored in your mind. It is on such a faithful day that I came across my own long-repressed memories and let them emerge to the surface. The most important part of the day, however, is the so-called Dinner of the Dead. After our mortal vessels are done feasting and joyfully sharing our moments of being alive, we were to leave the table and its contents, including all food as it is. The table was not to be cleaned until the morning. The idea behind such a ritual was that during this time of the year, when the veil between the living and the dead is at its finest, we would leave food for our past loved ones so they could enjoy and share our meal. It is often done as a way to give rest to the spirits that will come at night, and also for once in their eternal life to feel welcomed and cherished. When I was about 12 years old, my parents finally disclosed to me this bizarre ritual. For me, it was always a sort of excuse for my parents to not clean the table because they felt lazy. That night was one of the scariest nights in my entire life, as of course the thought of ghosts having a midnight supper in our living room was terrifying. It took me hours to fall asleep, as the imagination of a 12-year-old does not mix well with the emotion of fear and dread. My mind was conjuring all sorts of things that night. I remember imagining white figures emitting a faint blue light and being tangled in heavy chains, while their ragged clothes floated in the air. Such images, paired with the howling wind outside, made every moment dreadful. For once, every sound in my house at night felt unnatural and wicked. If there was a slight movement of the door, I would immediately freeze from fear, with the thought of an icy cold hand grasping it and trying to push it aside. Nonetheless, my young mind could not stay for long awake. Eventually, the sands of the Sandman had come to effect, causing me to close my eyes. As my mind was embracing the slumber, the white ghouls and their rusty chains were quickly swiped underneath the rug of wild and vivid child dreams and imaginations. The next day, the thrill of presents and toys immediately had made me forget about the past night's dreams and terror. With the years, I grew over this initially bizarre tradition. That is, until when I was 17. It was summer when I learned of my grandfather's passing. He was taken by stroke while working in his garden. Since we live abroad, we learned of the ill news by phone. Death itself is devastating news for one to bear, but I always thought that such matters, when disclosed by phone or text, are often more crushing. Nonetheless, my mother was devastated, and rightfully so. She knew deep down that his time was near, but learning it and knowing she could not even attend his funeral was even more crushing for her. Me, on the other hand, I felt shocked and cried, but it came to pass rather quickly. Now, you might say I'm heartless, but the reality is, I never really saw the old man, apart from 2 times when we went to visit in Bulgaria in the summer. What really never came to pass, however, was the constant feeling of guilt and not having enough time to spend with him. The 2 times I saw him were the most beautiful to me. They were the closest thing I ever had when it came to having a grandparent, and for those 2 moments, I am grateful. And when winter came rolling around that year, those feelings grew stronger. It was Christmas Eve and the time was approaching midnight. My sister and I were the only ones left at the table. We chatted and talked for a while, but at the same time, I felt an eerie sensation, one that I haven't felt for years. The burning log in the fireplace and the decent amount of consumed alcohol didn't seem to warm any part of my body. I felt a sudden breeze surrounding me, causing my hair to rise and send a shiver down my spine. I stood up and yawned while suggesting to go to sleep, an excuse, of course, for me to get away from this non-living room. I remember taking a glimpse back before closing the light switch. The once alive table adorned with beautiful food and festive materials was now dead and forgotten. Pieces of bone, once surrounded by meat, were nothing more but pale white claws piling over one another in a chaotic mess. It was cold that night. The winter wind howled once more outside, causing the rusty hinges of the windshields to shriek. As I prepared myself for bed, I could not shake the feeling of eeriness, creeping with shadowy hands around my chest. It was the very same feeling of dread and fear, as they began to slowly come to my mind, draining it from its rationality. The very same feeling from when I was 12, and had finally learned for the first time about this grim dinner of the dead. And, just like that, I remember exiting my room and walking in the empty and dark corridors towards the once living room. My footsteps, along with the cold and howling wind, echoed in the hollow corridor, making each step ever so slightly more dreadful. As I approached the door leading to the room, my heart began pounding and I shivered, not from cold but from fear. With my hand at halfway distance of the door handle, I stood there frozen when my gaze met the gap between the door and the floor. The emitting light from the fireplace was visible, but what made it truly terrifying was the occasional shadows that covered it, as if someone was passing by the door. For a moment, breathing became obsolete as fear took over. But when I was near my limits, my instinct took over, causing me to swallow and take a deep inhale. The air was dry and felt heavy. My throat felt sore, and I wanted to leave, but my mind was determined. Part of me wanted to see what lurked on the other side of the door. I took a step closer. My hand was met with the cold door handle. Before pulling it down to open for a moment, I took my time to recognize the new sounds around me. You see, when you stay for a long time in silence, you begin to pick up more sounds that previously were hidden between the chaotic and louder ones. For a moment, amidst the howling wind and the shrieking hinges, I heard the sound of clinging glasses and faint scraping sounds of cutlery on a plate. Faint voices like whispers were barely carried along the wind, coming from behind the door. I felt for a brief moment a sensation of adrenaline building inside me, and it was that brief moment I took to my advantage to open hastily the door, as if I was going to catch someone. But to my surprise, there was no one to catch. The table and its contents, faintly illuminated by the startled fire. The dancing lights of the Christmas tree reflected on the misty terrace glass door. I felt relieved, but somewhat disappointed. I didn't know what or who to expect that moment. But surely, it wasn't the empty and dead table. I strolled around the table as if I was looking for something hidden while constantly feeling watched. I approached the table. I took a glass and poured myself some rakia, which is an alcoholic spirit that is consumed by most Balkan countries. And it was probably the best spirit I met that night. As I drank, I stood and stared outside the glass doors that were smudged from moisture. There was a sensation of warmth around me. It could have been the fireplace or the alcohol, but it didn't feel like it was that. As I gazed outside, my windows focused on the reflection of the living room and the glass door, and that is where I saw everything. There were people gathered in the once empty seats, smiling and laughing, while the table was filled with all sorts of goodies and bright food. The reflection was bright and warm, and amidst those new faces I spotted one I knew well. My grandfather stood tall, next to a seated man dressed in a World War I uniform. My grandfather gazed at me and pointed towards me while speaking to his friends. They all looked at me and smiled as if they were talking about something I could not hear. As tears began to form, I quickly turned around to see, and there it was. It was real. The whole room was lit with bright colors. The fireplace was roaring. The table was covered with the very same food I ate that day, but around it, there were people I had never seen before in my entire life. There were women dressed in old clothes, dating back to the 19th century. Men with top hats and curled mustaches, holding their drink in one hand, while the other was gesturing as they talked. The sounds of plates and cutlery, along with the chatter of people, felt as if I was suddenly transported to some form of a party. As I stared, baffled at the ongoing festivities around me, I heard a faint, soft voice coming from behind me. A voice familiar in my head, but could not be placed exactly. Kaloyan, hello there, my boy. Are you enjoying the feast? My granddad stood behind me, proud and firm. His usual dark olive vest was still over his white linen shirt, and a smile was carved on his bright face. Oh, how you've grown. Shame that life had to split us apart so fast. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing as it tried to keep up with the current situation, but my heart and my soul had different intentions. I remember hugging him, and for once in the past few hours of constant dread, fear and cold, I felt warmth and love. I broke down. I cried on his shoulder, and vague words exited my mouth as they tried to form some sort of meaningful phrase, but it was impossible. A burning sensation as if I wanted to scream my feelings was building up, and eventually I did. I told him how I felt, how that I feel constantly angry for not coming to visit him more, how that I could have saved money to get a ticket perhaps to go there. I spoke how angry I was with myself that I took the past 2 visits and his life for granted. My guilt for not feeling much sadness when I learned he died, but as if everything was fine instead, and I just bottled my emotions down. But the old man didn't say a word. He just hugged me even more, and his soft voice penetrated my sobbing. There, my grandson. Don't shed more tears. We are all meant to die one day, and you could not have known at the time the meaning of time and death. You were a young child back then, Kaloyan. You were living the life as a young man should. Be grateful for our meeting, for this won't be the last. We will meet again. Not soon, you will be much older. And I will be here, waiting. We will be here, always for you. I felt a smile being forged on my face as his soft words echoed in my restless mind. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve, clearing my vision from my tears, and to my astonishment my grandfather stood there still. We then sat down and talked about various topics, my school, my dreams, and what I wanted to do. He had shared his wild stories about my mother and her sister, and how when they were young, and what wild adventures they had put him through. But then his next phrase hit me. With a sigh and a bit of sadness in his tone, he spoke firmly. I'm afraid this is all the time we had, Kalyan, for it's time for you to head back. What do you mean, Grandpa? Are you leaving? I stuttered, with a sincere sadness in my voice. He took a sip from his glass, and he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. No, Kalyan. I will always be here. It is you who are leaving. We shall meet again, but this is not your time. And with these words my vision became dark and blurry. The sounds of the once cheerful guests swirled like a vortex in my head, and were getting more and more faint, and suddenly were replaced with a cacophony of sounds and alarmed voices. They were repeating phrases that were ringing in my head. Are you okay? Wake up. Kalyan, this is not funny. Call an ambulance. When I opened my eyes, there was a bright light illuminating me. Around me I could vaguely see silhouettes that were beginning to look more familiar. I heard the signs of relief in their voices and phrases, how they praised God about me awakening. I saw my father with his hands on my chest, causing pressure to build up inside me, and shocked faces of my mother and sister, towering above me, were slowly taking form. Christmas Eve has a strange way of bringing people together, and even more strange ways to bring forth the emotions and memories of one's past. To this day, I still feel dread when the time comes around, but not as much since I now know that when my time comes I will see my grandfather again, and everyone else that I never had the chance of meeting. I came to realize why this day is one of the most loved by most people in my country, as it is a day where all our hidden secrets will come and emerge on the surface. A day of no judgment and no hatred. A day when the family comes together for one last time.
I have frequently wondered if the majority of mankind ever paused to reflect upon the occasionally titanic significance of dreams, and of the obscure world to which they belong. Whilst the greater number of our nocturnal visions are perhaps no more than faint and fantastic reflections of our waking experiences, Freud, to the contrary with his puerile symbolism, there is still a certain remainder whose immundane and ethereal character permits of no ordinary interpretation, and whose vaguely exciting and disquieting effort suggests possible minute glimpses into a sphere of mental existence no less important than physical life, yet separated from that life by an all but impassable barrier. From my experience, I cannot doubt but that man, when lost to terrestrial consciousness, is indeed sojourning in another and uncorporeal life, of far different nature from the life we know, and of which only the slightest and most indistinct memories linger after waking. From those blurred and fragmentary memories, we may infer much, yet prove little. We may guess that in dreams, life, matter, and vitality, as the earth knows such things, are not necessarily constant, and that time and space do not exist as our waking selves comprehend them. Sometimes I believe that this less material life is our truer life, and that our vain presence on the terraqueous globe is itself the secondary or merely virtual phenomenon. It was from a youthful reverie, filled with speculations of this sort, that I arose one afternoon in the winter of 1900 to 1901, when to the state psychopathic institution in which I served as an intern was brought the man whose case has ever since haunted me so unceasingly. His name, as given on records, was Joe Slater, or Slater, and his appearance was that of the typical denizen of the Catskill Mountain region, one of those strange, repellent scions of a primitive colonial peasant stock, whose isolation for nearly 3 centuries in the hilly fastness of a little-travelled countryside has caused them to sink to a kind of barbaric degeneracy, rather than advance with their more fortunately placed brethren of the thickly settled districts. Among these odd folk who correspond exactly to the decadent element of white trash in the South, law and morals are non-existent, and their general mental status is probably below that of any other section of the Native American people. Joe Slater, who came to the institution in the vigilant custody of 4 state policemen, and who was described as a highly dangerous character, certainly presented no evidence of his perilous disposition when I first beheld him. Though well above the middle stature and of somewhat brawny frame, he was given an absurd appearance of harmless stupidity by the pale, sleepy blueness of his small watery eyes, the scantiness of his neglected and never-shaven growth of yellow beard, and the listless drooping of his heavy nether lip. His age was unknown, since among his kind neither family records nor permanent family ties exist. But from the baldness of his head and front, and from the decayed condition of his teeth, the head surgeon wrote him down as a man of about 40. From the medical and court documents, we learned all that could be gathered of his case. This man, a vagabond, hunter and trapper, had always been strange in the eyes of his primitive associates. He had habitually slept at night beyond the ordinary time, and upon waking would often talk of unknown things in a manner so bizarre as to inspire fear even in the hearts of an unimaginative populace. Not that his form of language was at all unusual, for he never spoke, save in the debased patois of his environment, but the tone and tenor of his utterances were of such mysterious wildness that none might listen without apprehension. He himself was generally as terrified and baffled as his auditors, and within an hour after awakening would forget all that he had said, or at least all that had caused him to say what he did, relapsing into a bovine, half-amiable normality, like that of the other hill-dwellers. As Slater grew older, it appeared his matutinal aberrations had gradually increased in frequency and violence, till about a month before his arrival at the institution had occurred the shocking tragedy which caused his arrest by the authorities. One day near noon, after a profound sleep begun in a whiskey debauch at about 5 of the previous afternoon, the man had roused himself most suddenly, with ululations so horrible and unearthly that they brought several neighbors to his cabin, a filthy sty where he dwelt with a family as indescribable as himself. Rushing out into the snow, he had flung his arms aloft and commenced a series of leaps directly upward in the air, the while shouting his determination to reach some big cabin with brightness in the roof and walls and floor, and the loud, queer music far away. As two men of moderate size sought to restrain him, he had struggled with maniacal force and fury, screaming of his desire and need to find and kill a certain thing that shines and shakes and laughs. At length, after the temporary felling of one of his detainers with a sudden blow, he had flung himself upon the other in a demonic ecstasy of bloodthirstiness, shrieking fiendishly that he would jump high in the air and burn his way through anything that stopped him. Family and neighbors had now fled in a panic, and when the more courageous of them returned, Slater was gone, leaving behind an unrecognizable pulp-like thing that had been a living man but an hour before. None of the mountaineers had dared to pursue him, and it is likely that they would have welcomed his death from the cold. But when, several mornings later, they heard his screams from a distant ravine, they realized that he had somehow managed to survive, and that his removal in one way or another would be necessary. Then had followed an armed searching party, whose purpose, whatever it may have been originally, became that of a sheriff's posse after one of the seldom popular state troopers had by accident observed, then questioned, and finally joined the seekers. On the third day, Slater was found unconscious in the hollow of a tree and taken to the nearest jail, where alienists from Albany examined him as soon as his senses returned. To them, he told a simple story. He had, he said, gone to sleep one afternoon about sundown after drinking much liquor. He had awaked to find himself standing bloody-handed in the snow before his cabin, the mangled corpse of his neighbor, Peter Slater, at his feet. Horrified, he had taken to the woods in a vague effort to escape from the scene of which must have been his crime. Beyond these things he seemed to know nothing, nor could the expert questioning of his interrogators bring out a single additional fact. That night, Slater slept quietly, and the next morning he wakened with no singular feature, save a certain alteration of expression. Dr. Barnard, who had been watching the patient, thought he noticed in the pale blue eyes a certain gleam of peculiar quality, and in the flaccid lips an all but imperceptible tightening, as if of intelligent determination. But when questioned, Slater relapsed into the habitual vacancy of the mountaineer, and only reiterated what he had said on the preceding day. On the third morning occurred the first of the man's mental attacks. After some show of uneasiness and sleep, he burst forth into a frenzy so powerful that the combined efforts of 4 men were needed to bind him into a straitjacket. The alienists listened with keen attention to his words, since their curiosity had been aroused to a high pitch by the suggestive yet mostly conflicting and incoherent stories of his family and neighbors. Slater raved for upward of 15 minutes, babbling in his backwoods dialect of great edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all did he dwell upon some mysterious, blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he said, he would soar through abysses of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in his way. Thus ran his discourse until, with the greatest suddenness, he ceased. The fire of madness died from his eyes, and in dull wonder he looked at his questioners and asked why he was bound. Dr. Barnard unbuckled the leathern harness and did not restore it till night, when he succeeded in persuading Slater to don it of his own volition, for his own good. The man had now admitted that he sometimes talked queerly, though he knew not why. Within a week, 2 more attacks appeared, but from them, the doctors learned little. On the source of Slater's visions, they speculated at length, for since he could neither read nor write, and had apparently never heard a legend or fairy tale, this gorgeous imagery was quite inexplicable. That it could not come from any known myth or romance was made especially clear by the fact that the unfortunate lunatic expressed himself only in his own simple manner. He raved of things he did not understand and could not interpret, things which he claimed to have experienced, but which he could not have learned through any normal or connected narration. The alienists soon agreed that abnormal dreams were the foundation of the trouble, dreams whose vividness could, for a time, completely dominate the waking mind of this basically inferior man. With due formality, Slater was tried for murder, acquitted on the ground of insanity, and committed to the institution wherein I held so humble a post. I have said that I am a constant speculator concerning dream life, and from this you may judge of the eagerness with which I applied myself to the study of the new patient, as soon as I had fully ascertained the facts of his case. He seemed to sense a certain friendliness in me, born no doubt of the interest I could not conceal, and the gentle manner in which I questioned him. Not that he ever recognized me during his attacks, when I hung breathlessly upon his chaotic but cosmic word pictures, but he knew me in his quiet hours, when he would sit by his barred window, weaving baskets of straw and willow, and perhaps pining for the mountain freedom he could never enjoy again. His family never called to see him. Probably it had found another temporary head, after the manner of decadent mountain folk. By degrees I commenced to feel an overwhelming wonder at the mad and fantastic conceptions of Joe Slater. The man himself was pitiably inferior in mentality and language alike, but his glowing titanic visions, though described in a barbarous and disjointed jargon, were assuredly things which only a superior or even exceptional brain could conceive. How, I often asked myself, could the stolid imagination of a Catskill degenerate conjure up sights whose very possession argued a lurking spark of genius? How could any backwoods dullard have gained so much as an idea of those glittering realms of supernal radiance and space about which Slater ranted in his furious delirium? More and more I inclined to the belief that in the pitiful personality who cringed before me lay the disordered nucleus of something beyond my comprehension, something infinitely beyond the comprehension of my more experienced but less imaginative medical and scientific colleagues. And yet, I could extract nothing definite from the man. The sum of all my investigation was that, in a kind of semi-uncorporeal dream life, Slater wandered or floated through resplendent and prodigious valleys, meadows, gardens, cities, and palaces of light, in a region unbounded and unknown to man. That there he was no peasant or degenerate, but a creature of importance and vivid life, moving proudly and dominantly, and checked only by a certain deadly enemy who seemed to be a being of visible yet ethereal structure, and who did not appear to be of human shape, since Slater never referred to it as a man, or as aught save a thing. This thing had done Slater some hideous but unnamed wrong, which the maniac, if maniac he were, yearned to avenge. From the manner in which Slater alluded to their dealings, I judged that he and the luminous thing had met on equal terms, that in his dream existence the man himself was a luminous thing of the same race as his enemy. This impression was sustained by his frequent references to flying through space and burning all that impeded his progress. Yet these conceptions were formulated in rustic words, wholly inadequate to convey them, a circumstance which drove me to the conclusion that, if a true dream world indeed existed, oral language was not its medium for the transmission of thought. Could it be that the dream soul, inhabiting this inferior body, was desperately struggling to speak things which the simple and halting tongue of dullness could not utter? Could it be that I was face to face with intellectual emanations which would explain the mystery if I could but learn to discover and read them? I did not tell the older physicians of these things, for middle age is skeptical, cynical, and disinclined to accept new ideas. Besides, the head of the institution had but lately warned me in his paternal way that I was overworking and that my mind needed a rest. It had long been my belief that human thought consists basically of atomic or molecular motion convertible into ether waves of radiant energy like heat, light, and electricity. This belief had early led me to contemplate the possibility of telepathy or mental communication by means of suitable apparatus, and that I had in my college days prepared a set of transmitting and receiving instruments somewhat similar to the cumbrous devices employed in wireless telegraphy at that crude pre-radio period. These I had tested with a fellow student, but achieving no result, had soon packed them away with other scientific odds and ends for possible future use. Now, in my intense desire to probe into the dream life of Joe Slater, I sought these instruments again and spent several days in repairing them for action. When they were complete once more, I missed no opportunity for their trial. At each outburst of Slater's violence, I would fit the transmitter to his forehead and the receiver to my own, constantly making delicate adjustments for various hypothetical wavelengths of intellectual energy. I had but little notion of how the thought impressions would, if successfully conveyed, arouse an intelligent response in my brain, but I felt certain that I could detect and interpret them. Accordingly, I continued my experiments, though informing no one of their nature. It was on the 21st of February, 1901, that the thing finally occurred. As I look back across the years, I realize how unreal it seems, and sometimes half wonder if old Dr. Fenton was not right when he charged it all to my excited imagination. I recall that he listened with great kindness and patience when I told him, but afterward gave me a nerve powder and arranged for the half-year's vacation on which I departed the next week. That fateful night, I was wildly agitated and perturbed, for despite the excellent care he had received, Joe Slater was unmistakably dying. Perhaps it was his mountain freedom that he missed, or perhaps the turmoil in his brain had grown too acute for his rather sluggish physique. But at all events, the flame of vitality flickered low in the decadent body. He was drowsy near the end, and as darkness fell, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. I did not strap on the straitjacket, as was customary when he slept, since I saw that he was too feeble to be dangerous, even if he woke up in mental disorder once more before passing away. but I did place upon his head and mine the two ends of my cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. In the cell with us was one nurse, a mediocre fellow who did not understand the purpose of the apparatus or think to inquire into my course. As the hours wore on, I saw his head droop awkwardly in sleep, but I did not disturb him. I myself, lulled by the rhythmical breathing of the healthy and the dying man, must have nodded a little faster. The sound of weird lyric melody was what aroused me. Chords vibrations and harmonic ecstasies echoed passionately on every hand, while on my ravished sight burst the stupendous spectacle of ultimate beauty. Walls, columns and architraves of living fire blazed effulgently around the spot where I seemed to float in air, extending upward into an infinitely high-vaulted dome of indescribable splendor, blending with this display of palatial magnificence, or rather, supplanting it at times in kaleidoscopic rotation, were glimpses of wide plains and graceful valleys, high mountains and inviting grottos, covered with every lovely attribute of scenery which my delighted eye could conceive of, yet formed wholly of some glowing, ethereal plastic entity, which in consistency partook as much of spirit as of matter. As I gazed, I perceived that my own brain held the key to these enchanting metamorphoses, for each vista which appeared to me was the one my changing mind most wished to behold. Amidst this Elysian realm, I dwelt not as a stranger, for each sight and sound was familiar to me, just as it had been for unaccounted eons of eternity before, and would be for eternities to come. Then the resplendent aura of my brother of light drew near and held colloquy with me, soul to soul, with silent and perfect interchange of thought. The hour was one of approaching triumph, for was not my fellow being escaping at last from a degrading, periodic bondage, escaping forever and preparing to follow the accursed oppressor even unto the utmost fields of ether, that upon it might be wrought a flaming cosmic vengeance which would shake the spheres. We floated thus for a little time, when I perceived a slight blurring and fading of the objects around us, as though some force were recalling me to earth, where I least wished to go. The form near me seemed to feel a change also, for it gradually brought its discourse toward a conclusion, and itself prepared to quit the scene, fading from my sight at a rate somewhat less rapid than that of the other objects. A few more thoughts were exchanged, and I knew that the luminous one and I were being recalled to bondage, though for my brother of light it would be the last time. The sorry planet shell being nigh well spent, in less than an hour my fellow would be free to pursue the oppressor along the Milky Way and past the hither stars to the very confines of infinity. A well-defined shock separates my final impression of the fading scene of light from my sudden and somewhat shamefaced awakening and straightening up in my chair, as I saw the dying figure on the couch move hesitantly. Joe Slater was indeed awaking, though probably for the last time. As I looked more closely, I saw that in the sallow cheeks shone spots of color which had never before been present. The lips, too, seemed unusual, being tightly compressed, as if by the force of a stronger character than had been Slater's. The whole face finally began to grow tense, and the head turned restlessly with closed eyes. I did not arouse the sleeping nurse, but readjusted the slightly disarranged headbands of my telepathic radio, intent to catch any parting message the dreamer might have to deliver. All at once the head turned sharply in my direction, and the eyes fell open, causing me to stare in blank amazement at what I beheld. The man who had been Joe Slater, the Catskill decadent, was now gazing at me with a pair of luminous, expanded eyes, whose blue seemed subtly to have deepened. Neither mania nor degeneracy was visible in that gaze, and I felt beyond a doubt that I was viewing a face behind which lay an active mind of high order. At this juncture, my brain became aware of a steady external influence operating upon it. I closed my eyes to concentrate my thoughts more profoundly, and was rewarded by the positive knowledge that my long-sought mental message had come at last. Each transmitted idea formed rapidly in my mind, and though no actual language was employed, my habitual association of conception and expression was so great that I seemed to be receiving the message in ordinary English.
Joe Slater is dead,
Came the soul-petrifying voice or agency from beyond the wall of sleep. My opened eyes sought the couch of pain and curious horror, but the blue eyes were still calmly gazing, and the countenance was still intelligently animated.
He is better dead, for he was unfit to bear the active intellect of cosmic entity. His gross body could not undergo the needed adjustments between ethereal life and planet life. He was too much of an animal, too little of a man. Yet it is through his deficiency that you have come to discover me, for the cosmic and planet souls rightly should never meet. He has been my torment and diurnal prison for 42 of your terrestrial years. I am an entity like that which you yourself become in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light, and have floated with you in the effulgent valleys. It is not permitted me to tell your waking earth self of your real self, but we are all roamers of vast spaces and travelers in many ages. Next year, I may be dwelling in the dark Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel empire of San Chan, which is to come 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to the worlds that reel about the red Arcturus, and dwelt in the bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the Earth self know of life and its extent? How little indeed ought it to know for its own tranquility? Of the oppressor I cannot speak. You on Earth have unwittingly felt its distant presence. You, who without knowing idly gave to its blinking beacon the name of Algol, the demon star. It is to meet and conquer the oppressor that I have vainly striven for eons, held back by bodily encumbrances. Tonight, I go as a nemesis, bearing just and blazingly cataclysmic vengeance. Watch me in the sky close by the demon star. I cannot speak longer, for the body of Joe Slater grows cold and rigid, and the coarse brains are ceasing to vibrate as I wish. You have been my friend in the cosmos. You have been my only friend on this planet, the only soul to sense and seek for me within the repellent form which lies on this couch. We shall meet again, perhaps in the shining mists of Orion's sword, perhaps on a bleak plateau in prehistoric Asia, perhaps in unremembered dreams tonight, perhaps in some other form an aeon hence. when the solar system shall have been swept away.
At this point, the thought waves abruptly ceased, and the pale eyes of the dreamer, or can I say dead man, commenced to gaze fixedly. In a half stupor, I crossed over to the couch and felt of his wrist, but found it cold, stiff, and pulseless. The sallow cheeks paled again, and the thick lips fell open, disclosing the repulsively rotten fangs of the degenerate Joe Slater. I shivered, pulled a blanket over the hideous face, and awakened the nurse. Then I left the cell and went silently to my room. I had an insistent and unaccountable craving for a sleep, whose dreams I should not remember. The climax? What plain tale of science can boast of such a rhetorical effect? I have merely set down certain things appealing to me as facts, allowing you to construe them as you will. As I have already admitted, my superior, old Dr. Fenton, denies the reality of everything I have related. He vows that I was broken down with nervous strain and badly in need of the long vacation on full pay which he so generously gave me. He assures me on his professional honor that Joe Slater was but a low-grade paranoiac, whose fantastic notions must have come from the crude, hereditary folk tales which circulate in even the most decadent of communities. All this he tells me, yet I cannot forget what I saw in the sky on the night after Slater died. Lest you think me a biased witness, another's pen must add this final testimony, which may, perhaps, supply the climax you expect. I will quote the following account of the star Nova Persei, verbatim from the pages of that eminent astronomical authority, Professor Garrett P. Service. On February 22nd, 1901, a marvelous new star was discovered by Dr. Anderson of Edinburgh, not very far from Algol. No star had been visible at that point before. Within 24 hours, the stranger had become so bright that it outshone Capella. In a week or two it had visibly faded, and in the course of a few months it was hardly discernible with the naked eye.